Under the dim light of ancient whispers, a name lingers, haunting and magnetic: Lilith. She emerges, not as a single story but as a chorus of voices, each one aching with defiance, desire, and the weight of untold centuries. Her name is spoken in reverence, in fear, in anger. She is a phantom who refuses to fade, her spirit clawing through layers of myth and history to remind the world of her presence. In the oldest stories, she is not a demon or a rebel but a shadow on the wind, elusive and untamed. Ancient tablets carved by hands that lived thousands of years ago describe her as a being connected to storms and the wilderness, a force of nature, raw and unrelenting. She is neither good nor evil, simply unstoppable. As centuries pass, this storm takes on a face, a voice, and a name that can scarcely be contained. There is something intoxicating about her refusal to submit. The myths speak of a woman who stood beside the first man, born not of him but equal in every way. When told to bow, she did not. When told to shrink, she grew taller. And when the weight of obedience pressed down upon her shoulders, she did the unthinkable, she walked away. In her refusal, there was a clarity so fierce it burned those who witnessed it. She rejected a world that demanded her silence and, in doing so, became immortal in ways no man could fathom. Her departure is not the end of her story, but the beginning of a legend that twists and turns through time. In some tales, she becomes a spirit of the night, a figure cloaked in mystery and danger. They say she takes to the skies, her wings cutting through the darkness as she claims her place in a world that sought to erase her. Mothers whisper her name in fear, warning their children to stay close to the hearth, for Lilith roams where shadows gather. But even in these warnings, there is a strange respect, a recognition of her power. In another thread of her story, she meets angels sent to bring her back to the fold. They promise forgiveness, but she meets them with fire in her eyes and venom in her words. Her voice echoes through the ages, "Why should I return to a world that could not contain me?" These angels are said to tremble before her rage, yet they are not her enemies. They are merely messengers, caught in the storm of her defiance. As her myth weaves through cultures, her image changes like the phases of the moon. To some, she is a warning of unchecked power, a cautionary tale wrapped in feminine allure. To others, she is a beacon of strength, her defiance a call to those who refuse to be broken. The threads of her story are picked up by scribes, mystics, and artists, each one adding their voice to the symphony of her legend. Her tale spreads beyond borders, seeping into the dreams of poets and the fears of priests. In one land, she becomes a seductress, blamed for the desires men cannot control. In another, she is the protector of women who have been cast aside. Always, she is more than human, her spirit a reflection of what humanity fears and longs for in equal measure. There is an undeniable ache to her story, a yearning for something that was never given freely. Her existence is a rebellion against the silence imposed on women throughout history, a scream that refuses to be muffled. Her strength is magnetic, her pain palpable. She is the question that lingers when the stories are told. What if we all refused to be what others demanded? What if we chose freedom, no matter the cost? Her name, whispered in fear or defiance, carries the weight of centuries. It is spoken in temples, homes, and darkened rooms where candles flicker and shadows dance. Every time it is said, Lilith returns, her spirit brushing against the world like a wind that cannot be tamed. She is not done. Her story moves forward, carrying the weight of what has been and the promise of what could be. As you hold her name in your thoughts, she is already stirring, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. A fierce wind howled across the vast plains of ancient Mesopotamia, carrying with it a presence that stirred unease in the hearts of those who dared to listen. It wasn't the kind of wind that merely moved trees or scattered dust. It whispered, it moaned, it seemed alive. To the people who lived under the shadow of ziggurats and worshipped gods carved from stone, this wind wasn't just a force of nature. It was Lilith. Before her name was spoken in whispers of rebellion or fear, Lilith danced on the winds of Sumer. She was Lilitu, a being woven into the fabric of the unseen world. In the clay tablets of Sumerian scribes, her presence loomed as a spirit of the night, untouchable yet everywhere. She wasn't human, nor was she divine. She existed in the in-between, a shadow slipping through the cracks of a world that was desperately trying to define itself. They said she came with the night, when the moon rose and the land grew quiet. People claimed they felt her in the stillness and the sudden rustle of leaves when there was no breeze. Mothers clutched their infants tighter, their eyes scanning the darkness for signs of her. She was feared not because she could be seen, but because she couldn't. The ancients believed she roamed where the wind carried her, her presence as invisible as the air yet as potent as a storm. In the oldest of texts, Lilith was tied to the winds that brought both life and death. She was the gust that cooled a laborer's brow and the gale that tore through homes without warning. The Sumerians didn't see the world in black and white, and neither did they see her as purely evil. She was chaos embodied, unpredictable and untamed, a force of nature given a name. In the Akkadian language, her essence transformed further. She became more menacing, her whispers growing sharper, her form darker. Her connection to the wind was more than poetic. To the ancient mind, the wind was a gateway between worlds, the physical and the spiritual, the mortal and the divine. And Lilith? She was the gatekeeper. They said she lingered at crossroads, waiting for those who wandered too far from safety. Her laughter was carried by the wind, mocking and wild, a reminder that not all spirits were benevolent. But Lilith's legend didn't stop at the wind. The Sumerians spoke of her as a creature who preyed on vulnerability. She was drawn to new mothers and their babies, her name invoked in prayers scrawled on amulets and doorways. Was she truly the villain these charms warned against, or was she merely misunderstood? Perhaps the fear she inspired was rooted in her refusal to be controlled, to be caged by human understanding. She was a mirror of the unknown, reflecting humanity's deepest fears and desires. In Akkadian texts, she grew sharper, more defined. She was no longer just a spirit but a demoness, Lamashtu, whose claws were said to scrape the walls of nurseries, her hunger for the young insatiable. The wind, once her silent companion, now roared with her wrath. Yet, even in these darker depictions, there was something magnetic about her, an allure that kept her name alive even as the people sought to banish her. Her presence was etched into incantations and rituals, her name a force to be reckoned with. Men and women alike feared her, yes, but they also respected her. She was the embodiment of power that could not be tamed, a spirit that existed beyond their god's control. In a world where everything was assigned its place, Lilith refused to stay in hers. The winds still blow, carrying with them echoes of her name. Somewhere, in the rustle of leaves or the sudden chill of night air, her spirit lingers, waiting for those who dare to listen. The crackling of firelight danced across ancient parchment, shadows flickering as if alive, carrying whispers of a name older than time, Lilith. Her image, once carried on the winds of Mesopotamia, began to take on new forms, her essence reshaped and retold. Her story did not fade, it transformed, slipping through the cracks of history like water seeking a new path. And in the hands of Hebrew scribes, Lilith became something else entirely, a figure both feared and revered, her rebellion eternal. In the stillness of night, they said her presence could be felt. She was no longer merely a spirit of the wind, but a being with purpose, with intention. Her shadow stretched across the ancient world, shifting from a chaotic force of nature to something far more personal. The Hebrews whispered of her in hushed tones, their words tinged with both awe and dread. Lilith became the woman who defied God's order, a being who chose exile over submission. Her name emerged in the Alphabet of Ben Sira, an ancient text filled with stories that shaped the beliefs of a people. There, she was not an invisible spirit but flesh and blood, a woman created alongside Adam. She was his equal, born not from his rib but from the same earth, her hands and body shaped by the same divine touch. And yet, when Adam sought to rule over her, she refused. She would not bow, not to him, not to anyone. Her defiance was a spark in the darkness, a rebellion that would burn through centuries. The story goes that she spoke the sacred name of God and fled the Garden of Eden, her wings carrying her far from the paradise she could not call home. Angels pursued her, begging her to return, but she stood firm. "I will not go back," she said, her voice a blade cutting through the silence. She chose freedom, even if it meant becoming an outcast, even if it meant being cursed. The Hebrews began to speak of her as a demon, a predator who roamed the night, her beauty masking her danger. They said she preyed on men, seducing them in their dreams, stealing their strength. They said she sought out infants, her hatred for life twisted into a hunger that could never be satisfied. But beneath these accusations, there was another truth, one that few dared to say aloud. Lilith was feared not because she was evil, but because she was untamed. She was a reminder of what could not be controlled, of what lay beyond the boundaries of order. Her evolution from a Mesopotamian spirit to a Hebrew demoness was not random. It was a reflection of the fears and desires of those who told her story. In a world that valued obedience and submission, Lilith stood as a defiant figure, her existence a challenge to the status quo. She became a scapegoat for the unexplainable, a figure to blame for the chaos that could not be tamed. Yet, even as she was demonized, her power grew. Her name was spoken in prayers of protection, her image etched into amulets designed to ward her off. She was both enemy and guardian, a paradox that defied simple explanation. Through the centuries, her story was told and retold, each version adding layers to her legend. She became the embodiment of fear and fascination, a figure who could not be forgotten. And as her tale grew, so did her power. Her name was not just a word, it was a force, a reminder of the strength that comes from defiance. Even now, her spirit lingers in the echoes of those who speak her name, her story a thread woven through the fabric of time. She waits, her presence undeniable, her story far from over. In the beginning, there was no rib, no second thought, no hierarchy. There was Adam, and there was Lilith. Side by side, they emerged from the earth, their bodies molded from the same dust, their souls infused with the same divine breath. Theirs was a creation that spoke of balance, of equality, a design meant to reflect the harmony of the heavens. But harmony can shatter, and when it did, Lilith was the one who refused to fall in line. The Genesis Apocrypha, ancient whispers written on fragile scrolls, tells a story that shakes the foundations of what so many believe to be true. It says that before Eve, there was Lilith, a woman unlike any other. She was not crafted from Adam's body, but stood as his equal, her existence a mirror of his own. They were meant to share the world, to rule together, but the weight of expectation soon pressed against her shoulders. Adam, molded by the divine but shaped by his own desires, wanted more than a partner. He wanted dominance. When he commanded Lilith to lie beneath him, to submit to his will, she did what no one expected. She refused. Her voice, steady and sharp, echoed through the garden. "We are the same," she said, her words cutting like the edge of a blade. "We were made of the same earth, given the same breath. I will not bow to you." Her defiance was not a moment of weakness, but one of clarity, a recognition of her own worth. Yet, in a world that valued obedience above all else, her refusal was an act of rebellion. Adam, stunned by her boldness, turned to the Creator for help, and Lilith found herself at a crossroads. She could bend, or she could break free. The story says she chose freedom, uttering the ineffable name of God, a name so sacred it was said to hold the power of creation itself. With that name on her lips, she rose from the ground, her form transforming, her wings unfurling. She left the garden behind, her silhouette cutting through the sky like a blade of light. She did not look back. Her flight was not one of cowardice but of courage, an escape from a paradise that felt more like a prison. She traded the comforts of Eden for the chaos of the unknown, her wings carrying her to the edges of the world. But her departure was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The angels were sent to find her, to bring her back to Adam, to the life she had left behind. They found her at the shores of the Red Sea, a place where the waters churned and foamed, mirroring her own turmoil. They pleaded with her, offering forgiveness, a chance to return. But Lilith stood firm, her eyes burning with a fire that could not be extinguished. "I will not return to a place where I am less than whole," she said, her voice as steady as the waves crashing at her feet. The angels warned her of the consequences, the curses that would follow her, the loneliness that would seep into her bones. She did not flinch. Freedom, she knew, was worth any cost. And so, she became a wanderer, her name spoken in fear and awe. She was no longer just a woman but a symbol, a force that could not be contained. The garden grew quiet without her, the void she left behind filled by another. Eve was made from Adam's rib, her very creation a statement of submission, a design meant to ensure there would be no more rebellion. But Lilith's shadow lingered. Her name became a warning, her defiance twisted into tales of seduction and danger. They said she prowled the night, her beauty a trap, her power a threat. They said she sought vengeance, her wrath directed at the children of those who had replaced her. Yet, even in these stories, there was something undeniable about her, a strength that could not be silenced, a fire that refused to be extinguished. Her story is not one of endings, but of endurance. She remains a figure who challenges the narratives we are told, her name a reminder of the cost of freedom and the strength it takes to claim it. Somewhere, her wings still beat against the winds of history, carrying her spirit forward, unbroken. The air in Eden was heavy, not with the sweetness of fruit or the warmth of sunlight, but with the unspoken tension between two beings born of the same soil. Adam and Lilith stood in the lush expanse, the weight of expectation pressing down like a storm about to break. For a moment, everything was still. The trees seemed to lean in, the rivers quieted their songs, as if the very garden itself held its breath. Adam's words, firm and unyielding, cut through the silence. "You will submit to me," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the flicker of doubt. Lilith met his gaze, her own eyes burning with something far more potent, defiance. The earth beneath her feet seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, the soil that had birthed them both alive with her fury. "Why should I?" she asked, her voice low but steady, carrying the weight of a question that could not be ignored. "We were made the same. I owe you nothing." Her words weren't just defiance, they were a declaration of truth, a refusal to accept a world that demanded her submission for the sake of peace. Adam's brow furrowed, frustration bubbling to the surface. To him, this was unnatural, wrong. A woman, his equal? No. She was supposed to be his companion, his support, not his challenger. His hand reached out, not in anger but in control, a gesture meant to pull her back into the order he believed was right. But Lilith stepped away, her movements deliberate, her stance unyielding. The Creator's presence loomed over them, silent yet all-seeing. Adam's pleas rose like smoke, a desperate cry for intervention. He could not understand why she would not comply, why she would not accept the role he believed was hers. But Lilith did not waver. Her voice rose, strong and unwavering, as she spoke the sacred name, the Tetragrammaton, a word so holy it was said to carry the power of life and death. And in that moment, she was gone. Wings unfolded from her back, ethereal and fierce, lifting her from the ground. The garden seemed to shudder as she took flight, her figure a streak of light against the vast sky. The trees bent as if bowing to her, the rivers roared as if cheering her on. She had chosen exile over obedience, freedom over comfort. But freedom came with a cost. The Creator sent angels after her, 3 messengers of divine will, their mission clear: bring her back. They found her at the edges of the world, where the waters of the Red Sea churned with restless energy. She stood there, unbowed, her feet planted firmly on the rocky shore. The angels pleaded, their voices soft yet insistent. "Return to the garden," they urged. "There is still a place for you." Lilith's laughter rang out, sharp and unyielding, a sound that seemed to cut through the air like a blade. "A place," she said, her tone dripping with defiance. "A place where I must kneel? A place where I am less than what I am?" She turned her gaze to the horizon, the endless expanse of sky and sea. "I would rather walk alone in the wilderness than crawl in the shadow of another." The angels warned her of the consequences, of the curses that would follow her decision. She listened, her face unreadable, her heart unshaken. When they left, defeated, she remained on the shore, her figure a testament to her choice. In the garden, Adam was given another. Eve, born not from the earth, but from his rib, her creation an act of compliance. She would not challenge him, would not question him. But in the corners of his mind, in the echoes of the garden's whispers, Adam could still feel Lilith's presence. She was gone, but she was not forgotten. Her departure was not a retreat. It was a statement, a blazing act of self-assertion that reverberated through time. She had been offered the comfort of paradise, but rejected it for the uncertain promise of her own truth. And in doing so, she became more than a figure of legend. She became a force that could not be silenced. The garden, once whole, now carried her absence like a scar, a reminder that even in the face of divine order, the human spirit can choose freedom. In the dim light of ancient study halls, rabbis hunched over scrolls, their voices a soft hum of debate and inquiry. Amid their discussions of law and morality, a name whispered through the air like a shadow: Lilith. Her presence in their texts was fleeting, fragmented, but undeniable. She was more than myth, more than metaphor. She was a specter lingering at the edges of their words, a figure too bold, too wild, to be contained by the stories of men. The Talmud spoke of her with the weight of warning. She was the night demon, the seductress who preyed upon the unsuspecting, her beauty as sharp as her vengeance. She was said to haunt the dreams of men, her allure irresistible yet perilous. But beneath these tales of fear, there was a different story. Lilith was not simply a demon, she was a challenge to the world's order, a reminder of what it meant to defy. Her name surfaced again in the Alphabet of Ben Sira, not as a spirit of the night but as the first woman. The scrolls painted a picture that was both haunting and vivid. Lilith, born from the same earth as Adam, her form molded by the same divine hands. She was not an afterthought, not a part of another. She was whole, complete, equal. And it was this equality that became her curse. The texts described her confrontation with Adam, the moment when paradise unraveled. He sought to dominate, to take what he believed was his right. She, unyielding, refused to submit. Their voices rose, a storm of words and will, until Lilith spoke the sacred name of God and vanished. The scribes captured her flight with words that trembled with both fear and awe. She had rejected Eden itself, choosing exile over obedience, her wings cutting through the heavens as if to carve her own place among the stars. The rabbis debated her actions, their words layered with reverence and caution. Was she wicked, or was she wise? A danger, or a warning? To some, she was the source of chaos, the one who brought disorder into the world. To others, she was a symbol of strength, her defiance a mirror of humanity's own struggle against the confines of expectation. The Alphabet of Ben Sira gave her a voice, sharp and clear, cutting through centuries of silence. She confronted Adam, and later the angels sent to retrieve her, with a resolve that refused to bend. "Why should I lie beneath you?" she asked Adam, her question not of rebellion but of truth. To the angels, she made no apologies, no excuses. She stood by her choice, her eyes unflinching in the face of judgment. But the texts did not stop with her defiance. They painted her as a predator, her vengeance directed at the innocent. The rabbis described her roaming the night, seeking newborns, her rage transforming into hunger. They wrote of her as both a threat and a protector, her name etched into amulets meant to ward her off. Her duality was undeniable, she was the danger in the dark and the shield against it, her power both feared and invoked. The Talmud and the Alphabet of Ben Sira did more than preserve her story. They transformed her into an archetype, a figure who transcended her origins. She was not just Lilith, the first woman or the demon. She was Lilith, the untamed force, the reminder that even in the face of creation, there is a choice. Her presence lingered in their texts, a question unanswered, a challenge unresolved. And yet, even in their attempts to confine her to the role of villain, they could not erase the fire in her story. Her defiance, her refusal, her flight, these were not the marks of a demon but of a spirit too vast to be contained. The rabbis might have tried to define her, but Lilith remained elusive, her story slipping through the cracks of their words, a presence that could not be silenced. The night air held a sharp stillness, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant cry of an animal. In the shadows, something moved, not seen, but felt. A presence, ancient and restless, brushed against the edges of awareness. It was Lilith, they said, the demoness of the night, her name whispered in fear and awe. She was no longer the woman who walked in Eden, no longer the one who defied. She had become something else, something darker. The transformation was not hers alone. It was the world's. Stories began to shift, her rebellion reframed as malice, her independence twisted into danger. What began as defiance in Eden became something far more sinister in the eyes of those who sought to control her legacy. Lilith, the equal, the unbowed, was recast as Lilith, the predator, the demoness who stalked the vulnerable. They said she prowled the night, her steps silent as death itself. She sought the weak, the defenseless, the newborns sleeping in their cradles, the mothers who had yet to heal. Her beauty, once a mark of her divine creation, became a trap. Her allure was a snare, her gaze a curse. Men were warned not to look into her eyes, not to follow her voice, for it would lead them to ruin. But was it vengeance, or was it survival? The tales whispered of her hunger, an insatiable need that drove her to take what had been denied. She had been cast out, stripped of her place in paradise, and condemned to the fringes of existence. Alone, unloved, she became something fierce and unforgiving. She was no longer just Lilith. She was the embodiment of every fear, every desire that could not be spoken aloud. The rabbis told of her as a mother of demons, her children born of the winds and the shadows. They said she birthed 100 each day, their forms twisted, their cries echoing across the void. But for each child she bore, 100 others fell to the swords of angels sent to punish her. Her rage grew with every loss, her grief woven into the fabric of her being. She was painted as the cause of miscarriages, the thief of life before it had even begun. Amulets bearing the names of angels were hung above cradles, prayers murmured to keep her at bay. Mothers clutched their infants close, their fear a constant reminder of her presence. Yet even in these acts of protection, there was an acknowledgement of her power, a recognition of the force that could not be ignored. Her story spread, her name crossing borders and cultures, her form taking on new shapes. To some, she was the succubus, the spirit who crept into the dreams of men, her touch leaving them weak and drained. To others, she was the storm, the wind that howled through the night, uprooting trees and tearing apart homes. Her image became a warning, her story a lesson in the dangers of disobedience and desire. Yet, beneath the layers of fear and hatred, her rebellion still glimmered like a faint ember. Her transformation into a demoness was not just a punishment, it was a testament to her refusal to be silenced. Even as her name was cursed, it was remembered. Even as she was vilified, she was feared. And fear, as much as hatred, is a form of respect. The world might have tried to turn her into a monster, but Lilith remained a force beyond comprehension. She was the night, the storm, the whisper in the darkness that could not be ignored. Her form shifted, her story changed, but the essence of who she was, the one who would not bow, endured. Somewhere, in the quietest moments of the night, when the wind seemed to speak and the shadows seemed to move, her spirit lingered, unbroken and eternal. The name whispered like a shadow across millennia, Lilith. It hung in the air, heavy with meaning, layered with echoes of the past. To speak it was to summon the wind, to feel the chill of night pressing close, to sense the unseen brushing against your skin. There was something primal in its sound, something that reached deep into the core of human fear and fascination. But what was it about this name, this word, that carried such weight? The syllables themselves felt ancient, rooted in a time when words were spells, and names held power. Lilith. It began as Lilitu, the Sumerian word for wind, soft and fleeting yet capable of unrelenting force. The wind was untouchable, uncatchable, slipping through fingers like a phantom. It whispered through cracks and crevices, howling its presence but never revealing its source. Like Lilith herself, the wind was both everywhere and nowhere, a force unseen yet undeniably felt. As the word moved through cultures, its meanings deepened. In Akkadian, Lilitu transformed, becoming not just the wind but the spirit carried by it. She was the breath of the storm, the chill that crept into a room, the sudden gust that extinguished a flame. Her presence was feared, her name a warning that something wild, something untamable, had arrived. To speak of Lilith was to acknowledge the thin veil between the human and the otherworldly, the fragile line separating life from the forces that existed just beyond reach. And then there was the night. Lilith's name became entwined with Lil, the Hebrew word for night, a connection that felt almost inevitable. The night was her domain, its darkness a mirror of her untamed spirit. In the stillness of the hours after dusk, her name carried an extra weight, a sense that she was watching, waiting, just beyond the edges of the firelight. The night was her canvas, the wind her voice, and her name the thread that bound them together. But the word was more than sound, it was essence. To say Lilith was to call upon not just the woman or the demon, but the idea of something beyond control. It was a name that embodied contradiction, a blend of beauty and danger, freedom and fear, presence and absence. It was not a name that one carried lightly, it was a name that carried you, sweeping you into its storm, its shadows. Lilith was tied to the Lilu, male spirits of the night, and the Lilitu, their female counterparts. These spirits were restless, neither living nor dead, caught between worlds. They were said to haunt desolate places, to roam where others dared not tread. In their names, Lilith found her kin, her place among the spirits that defied boundaries. Her name became their queen, their leader, the embodiment of their wandering, untamed nature. The evolution of her name was not a straight line. It twisted and turned, taking on new shapes, new meanings, as it passed through the tongues of those who feared her and those who sought to control her. To some, her name was a curse, a sound to be uttered with caution, if at all. To others, it was a shield, carved into amulets to protect against her wrath. But no matter how it was used, her name remained a force, a reminder of something that could not be fully understood or tamed. There was power in her name, a power that transcended language and time. It carried the weight of the wind, the silence of the night, the spirit of rebellion. To speak it was to acknowledge her presence, to invite the unseen into the light. And even as her story changed, as she became demon and danger, her name remained, unyielding, eternal, a whisper in the darkness that could not be silenced. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the earth, as if it too could feel the weight of the stories buried in time. In that light, she moved, silent, untouchable, a figure born of shadows and ancient wisdom. Lilith. She wasn't the first of her kind, nor the last, but in her was the echo of every goddess who ever wore the mantle of power and mystery. The stories might have tried to paint her as a villain, but they couldn't erase the truth of her origins. Long before the Abrahamic texts shaped her into something to fear, Lilith existed as something else. She was a force of nature, a reflection of the divine feminine, just as other goddesses were. She was connected to them, as if their spirits all spoke the same language, one that predated the scriptures of men. In the ancient winds, the earth's pulse, the moon's embrace, Lilith and the goddesses who came before her were one. In the ancient world, before the advent of monotheism, there were goddesses who ruled the earth, the sky, the seas. Powerful, independent, full of life and death. They were the makers, the destroyers, the ones who understood the balance of all things. From the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, where Ishtar and Inanna were revered as protectresses of love, war, and fertility, to the wild, untamed nature of the ancient Egyptians, where Sekhmet embodied strength and vengeance, Lilith shared in their essence. She too was a force of creation and destruction, a figure who demanded respect and feared no one. Ishtar, with her dual nature as both a goddess of fertility and a bringer of death, seemed to be Lilith's kindred spirit. Both were complex, multifaceted beings, each capable of great love and great wrath. They embodied contradictions that men could never understand, just as Lilith did. She wasn't just a lover or a mother or a demon. She was all of them, each aspect as vital as the next. Her connections to Ishtar were more than just symbolic. It was as if their fates had always been intertwined, as if the very fabric of the universe knew that goddesses like them couldn't be contained by simple definitions. Then, in the distant corners of the world, there was the goddess Artemis. The virgin huntress, protector of women, wild in her independence and strength. Artemis was the embodiment of what Lilith once was, free from the chains of a patriarchal world, unafraid to exist outside the confines of expected roles. Both Artemis and Lilith understood the value of solitude, of being alone, of embracing their full, wild nature without apology. As much as Lilith stood apart, she was also deeply connected to these goddesses, to the divine feminine that stretched back through history. In a world where women were often silenced, these goddesses stood as beacons of what was possible when one refused to bow. They were the women who were feared because they were powerful. The ones who broke free from the roles carved for them and forged their own paths. Lilith's rebellion wasn't born of malice, it was born of necessity. She knew that to be her true self, she had to reject the idea that she was made to serve. She had to be the force that nature demanded of her. The similarities between Lilith and these goddesses were not mere happenstance. They were all reflections of the same energy, the same divine pulse that coursed through the earth, the skies, and the oceans. Each one was a manifestation of the feminine power that could not be defined, that could not be tamed. Lilith was their echo, their distant, misunderstood child who walked a different path but shared in their essence. The same wildness, the same ferocity, the same untamable spirit lived in her, just as it had in them. And yet, over time, those who sought to control the narrative began to twist Lilith's image. They sought to suppress the very essence she represented. They pushed her from the sacred temples, away from the altars, and turned her into a demon, a figure of fear. But even in that transformation, something of the divine feminine remained. Even as she was cast as the mother of demons, Lilith was still a symbol of the power that could not be suppressed. She was the goddess in exile, the one who refused to conform, and her legacy was too strong to be erased. As her story changed, so did her meaning. She was no longer just a goddess, no longer just a demon. She became a symbol of everything women were meant to be: strong, fierce, independent, unapologetic. Those who came before her, those ancient goddesses, lived on in her. They whispered through her, their strength carried forward in her every defiant action, her every choice to stand against the world. In the end, Lilith was not just a name or a figure. She was a testament to something much older, much more powerful. She was a living, breathing embodiment of the feminine divine, strong, untamed, eternal. The world might have changed, but the essence of Lilith, like the goddesses before her, remained forever etched in the winds of time, forever whispering to those who would listen. The world was smaller than it seemed, an interconnected web of paths winding through deserts, over mountains, and across rivers. In this ancient world, where the beat of human feet echoed along trade routes, stories traveled just as far as the goods did. One such story, like a whisper on the wind, began its long journey, moving from the shores of Mesopotamia to the far corners of the earth, carried by merchants, wanderers, and conquerors. It was a story of Lilith, of a figure who defied the rules, whose name would grow and change, carried by the tides of history. It began quietly, just a murmured name in a Sumerian temple, a name spoken in the dark corners of the night. But as the trade caravans wound their way through the ancient world, from Urartu to Tyre, from the Euphrates to the Nile, Lilith's myth spread. Traders exchanged not only silk and spices, but stories, beliefs, and symbols. Each culture she touched shaped her, altered her, adapted her to its own needs. She wasn't the same Lilith everywhere, but she was always there, a shadow beneath the surface of every culture. In Mesopotamia, she was the wild spirit of the wind, a goddess of storms and vengeance, but as her myth reached the Mediterranean world, she began to take on new shapes. In the cities of Egypt, where the Nile flowed like blood through the heart of the empire, she transformed, becoming an agent of protection, a goddess who could heal as easily as she could destroy. She was a threat to men, but also a protector of women, a reminder that the feminine spirit could not be shackled. Through the bustling streets of ancient Alexandria, the myth of Lilith spread like fire on dry grass, touching the minds of philosophers, priests, and mystics alike. Her name was spoken with reverence and fear in the same breath, for Lilith was both goddess and demon, both life and death. The Egyptians, with their deep understanding of the balance between the destructive and the creative forces, adopted her as a powerful figure of transformation. She became a symbol of feminine power and strength, yet also a reminder of the dangers of unchecked rage. As the myth moved through the Roman Empire, where the streets pulsed with the feet of conquerors and traders from across the known world, Lilith's name continued to evolve. She passed through the gates of the Roman Empire like a shadow, carried by soldiers, merchants, and even the slaves who traveled the length and breadth of the empire. It was in these far-reaching corners of the empire that the darker aspects of Lilith's character began to shine brighter. She became associated with the night, with demons and spirits that preyed upon the vulnerable. But she was also a symbol of rebellion, a figure who resisted the authority of men. To the Romans, she was a dangerous creature, a force that could not be tamed. But as her myth spread, there were those who saw her differently. In the bustling markets of Byzantium, in the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, Lilith's story began to take on a different hue. The Byzantines, heirs to the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, saw Lilith as a reflection of their own complex mythology. She became not just a demon, but a symbol of the dangerous, untamed aspects of the feminine. The Greeks, ever in love with their pantheon of gods and goddesses, found something familiar in her, something both beautiful and terrifying. Lilith, to them, was a figure of pure desire, a woman who defied expectations, who refused to be controlled. She was both a victim and a conqueror, a woman whose strength came from her refusal to submit to a world that sought to crush her. As she traveled, Lilith became a symbol of the tension between the old world and the new. With each migration of people, with each trade route she followed, her myth was altered to fit the needs of the culture she entered. In the harsh deserts of Arabia, where the wind howled like a predator, she became a figure of terror, a spirit who could take the life of an infant in a single breath. In the cold, dark lands of Europe, she became a witch, a creature who preyed upon the vulnerable in the dead of night. In India, she was seen as a manifestation of Kali, a goddess of destruction and rebirth, whose power was both feared and revered. But always, in every place, and every culture, the essence of Lilith remained the same, a woman who would not be controlled. Whether she was a night demon, a mother, or a spirit of vengeance, Lilith was the embodiment of the untamed feminine. She was the force of nature that refused to bow, the wild spirit that could not be contained. And though her name changed and morphed, though the myths around her were rewritten and reshaped, she was always there, in the wind, in the shadows, and the whispers of every culture she touched. With each step she took across the world, Lilith's presence grew. She was not just a story told in whispers anymore. She became a force, a symbol, a warning. Her myth became part of the fabric of humanity, woven into the very tapestry of culture, history, and belief. Every trade route, every migration, every conquest carried Lilith's myth to new corners of the world. She was reborn in every culture, given new names and new faces, but always carrying the same core message: the feminine spirit cannot be contained. And so, Lilith's myth continued to spread, expanding like ripples across the water, touching every shore, every corner of the world. Each culture that encountered her saw a different side of her, each myth reflecting the fears, desires, and struggles of the people who told it. Yet, in every iteration, Lilith remained the same, a symbol of rebellion, of strength, of the untamed power of the feminine. Through trade and migration, her name echoed across time, a haunting reminder that no matter how far the world stretched, the spirit of Lilith would always follow. There's something unsettling about the silence that followed her departure. Lilith's absence echoed through the halls of ancient temples, the whispers of her name reduced to nothing more than a faint memory. But that silence wasn't just empty. It was deliberate. It was a quiet erasure, one that would reverberate through centuries, silencing a voice that refused to bow. What was it about Lilith that threatened the very foundation of patriarchal power? In the beginning, she was powerful, an independent spirit, a woman who stood shoulder to shoulder with Adam, not beneath him. She was not made from his rib, but from the same dust. She was equal, and that equality was her undoing. The stories didn't need to be rewritten. Her defiance was clear in her very existence. She was a woman who understood her worth, who knew she didn't need to be subjugated, who refused to be a subordinate. But as the patriarchal systems of the world grew stronger, Lilith's story began to shift, morphing from a rebellious equal to something darker. The fear that she inspired was palpable, a force that couldn't be contained, a feminine power that resisted control. Her story was turned on its head, and the women who once found strength in her defiance were now taught to fear her. The patriarchal religions didn't just dismiss her, they actively demonized her. What had once been a figure of wild, untamed independence became a monster. The serpent of rebellion was no longer a symbol of empowerment, but one of destruction. They needed her to be a warning, a symbol of what happened when a woman dared to challenge the divine order. Lilith, in their eyes, was not simply a rebel, she was chaos incarnate. She was portrayed as a demoness, an evil spirit that haunted the night, preying upon infants and women in childbirth. Her name, once whispered with awe and respect, became a curse. The powerful forces that sought to control the narrative rewrote her story, erasing the very parts of her that threatened their authority. Her strength became her villainy. Her autonomy became her madness. And so, Lilith was cast out of the Eden of myth and replaced with a new image of womanhood, one that would be obedient, passive, and subservient to the will of men. What is it about a woman's independence that can provoke such fear? Why does a woman who stands on equal footing with a man become the target of such vilification? Lilith's rejection of subservience was more than a personal act of defiance. It was a direct challenge to the foundations of the patriarchal religion. And that challenge could not go unanswered. They had to make her into something monstrous, something that could be feared, because if she was seen as anything else, anything powerful or free, what would happen to the structure of their world? The answer, as history has shown, would be the collapse of the systems that upheld male authority. As these systems grew stronger, the stories of women like Lilith were lost in the shadows of myth. Where once there had been reverence for a feminine spirit of empowerment, now there was only fear of a demoness who preyed on the innocent. And those who could not silence her entirely, twisted her into something they could control. They created legends of her attacks on newborns, her insatiable lust, her rage at the very idea of submission. They made her a creature of the night, feeding off the fears and insecurities of those who dared to cross her path. Her myth became a tool in their fight for control, a way to keep women in line by showing them the consequences of defying the established order. But still, Lilith's story lived on, whispered in the corners of history. As much as patriarchal religion sought to stamp out her memory, there were those who remembered. Women who saw in Lilith not a demon, but a reflection of their own struggle. She was a symbol of the fight against being trapped in a world that wanted to strip away their power, their autonomy. She was, in essence, the woman who would never be silenced, the woman who would never be forced to bend. Even in the darkest corners of patriarchal religion, where her name was spat out with disgust, Lilith found a way to survive. In the stories that were passed down by those who lived outside the grasp of religious authority, Lilith remained a figure of strength. She became a symbol of resistance, of the power of the feminine spirit to rise above the limitations imposed upon it. In the spaces where patriarchal religion could not reach, Lilith thrived. And so, even as the patriarchs tried to bury her story, even as they tried to demonize her, Lilith found a way to live on. Her name became a whispered word among those who refused to bow. She became a symbol of the rebellion that could never be crushed. Her myth, though twisted and corrupted, never fully disappeared. And in the shadows of history, she waited, her voice growing louder as the centuries passed. Because Lilith was not a story that could be silenced. No matter how much the patriarchy tried to demonize her, her essence remained. And that, in the end, was what terrified them the most. Her name was once a whisper in the wind, a shadow lingering just outside the grasp of history. But as the world changed, so too did the way she was remembered. Lilith, the woman who once defied the very laws of creation, began to emerge from the darkness where she had been buried for centuries. No longer was she the demoness, the monstrous figure who haunted the corners of men's fears. Instead, she stood before the world, fierce and unbroken, as a symbol of something far more powerful, female agency. What if the story of Lilith wasn't one of evil at all? What if, instead, it was the story of a woman who demanded to be seen, to be heard, to be equal? What if Lilith was not a symbol of rebellion for the sake of destruction, but for the sake of creation, the creation of her own path, her own destiny? In this new interpretation, Lilith wasn't a villain. She was a hero. She was the embodiment of a woman who would not bend to the will of anyone, not even the Creator. For centuries, her story was rewritten, twisted, turned into a warning: do not be like Lilith. Do not defy the natural order. But over time, the narrative shifted. No longer did Lilith's refusal to submit carry the same ominous weight. Instead, it became an emblem of empowerment. A woman standing alone, claiming her autonomy, her voice, her place in the world. In this light, Lilith became a feminist icon, a figure that spoke to women across time, cultures, and continents. Her defiance in the Garden of Eden wasn't an act of destruction. It was an act of self-preservation, a declaration that she, too, had a right to exist on her own terms. When she left Eden, she didn't abandon Adam or the world. She chose to leave behind a life that would have kept her chained. In her decision, she showed the world that it was better to walk alone, with dignity, than to live in the shadows of another's will. It's easy to see how the patriarchal systems that rose in her wake could not tolerate Lilith's existence. She was too free, too strong, too independent. She didn't fit into the mold that was being constructed for women. The image of Lilith as a demoness, wild, dangerous, untamable, served a purpose. She was meant to frighten women into submission. But the truth was something else entirely. Lilith was never the villain of the story. She was the hero in her own right, a woman who carved out her own space in a world that was trying to make her invisible. For those who have ever felt the weight of society's expectations bearing down on them, Lilith's story is one of solidarity. Her decision to refuse submission is a story for those who have ever been told that their voice doesn't matter, that their autonomy is not theirs to claim. Lilith was the first woman to say no, to stand up and say, "I deserve the same as anyone else. I deserve my voice, my independence, my equality." The stories of women who were silenced, pushed to the edges of history, are countless. But Lilith's was different. Her story survived, even if it was twisted and buried. It survived because there is something in her defiance that resonates with all those who have ever been oppressed, marginalized, or made to feel inferior. Lilith became the archetype of female agency, a symbol of the strength it takes to say no and walk away. She became the symbol of every woman who has ever had to fight for her place in a world that wanted to keep her in the shadows. In the feminist movement, Lilith became a figure of inspiration. Her story was reclaimed, reinterpreted, and celebrated. She wasn't just a footnote in a patriarchal narrative anymore. She became a goddess of independence, a beacon for all those who dared to challenge the norms, to speak up, and to be unapologetically themselves. Lilith wasn't the demon, she was the pioneer, the trailblazer, the woman who refused to shrink. As the years went by, Lilith's role as a feminist icon continued to grow. She was no longer a character of mythology, she became a symbol, an emblem of resistance against the forces that sought to limit women's potential. She was the embodiment of every woman who had ever been told to stay quiet, to be seen but not heard. She was the voice of rebellion, the spirit of independence. She was the woman who said, "I will not conform." Her story speaks to those who have felt oppressed by societal expectations, by cultural norms, or by the structures that seek to control them. Lilith's agency was her strength. It was her refusal to be anything less than she was. She embodied the courage to stand alone, to face the world on her own terms, and to carve out her own space in the world, even when that space was not given to her. As time passed, more and more women began to identify with Lilith, to see her not as a threat, but as a symbol of hope. Her story of defiance became a source of inspiration for those who refused to be silenced, for those who refused to conform to a world that wanted to put them in boxes. Lilith became a rallying cry for women everywhere, a reminder that their voices matter, their autonomy is theirs to claim, and their power is in their own hands. It's clear now, Lilith was never the villain. She was always the hero. She was always the woman who stood firm, who stood tall, and who would never, ever bend. Her story, once hidden in the shadows, has now become a light for all those who dare to walk their own path, to refuse to be anything less than themselves. And for that, we will never forget her. In the hushed silence of midnight, when the world seemed to hold its breath, there were whispers of a name spoken only in the most sacred and forbidden circles. Lilith. She wasn't just a shadowy figure of ancient tales, but an enigmatic force that wove herself into the very fabric of Jewish mysticism. In the mystical traditions of the Kabbalah and the Zohar, she was neither forgotten nor silenced. Instead, she was given a role that pulsed with both danger and allure, a force at the edges of divinity and darkness. Her presence in the mystical texts wasn't accidental. Lilith was a name that could unsettle even the most devout, for she was said to dwell where the balance of light and shadow trembled. She wasn't merely a woman or a demoness. She was an entity who danced on the fringes of creation, where the boundaries of holiness blurred with the chaotic beauty of the unknown. The Kabbalists didn't shy away from her complexity, they leaned into it, weaving her story into the heart of their spiritual frameworks. They spoke of her as a force tied to the Sitra Achra, the other side, a realm not of outright evil, but of potential, of what lay outside the bounds of divine order. Lilith wasn't merely a figure to fear, she was a reminder of the untamed energies of existence, energies that, if left unchecked, could challenge the divine harmony. She was chaos, yes, but also possibility. In her rebellion and her refusal to conform, she represented the raw power of free will, of choosing one's path even when it defied the ordained. In the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah, Lilith wasn't cast aside as a simple villain. She was given layers, depth, and purpose. They spoke of her as Adam's equal, not just in body but in soul. When she left Eden, she didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, she transformed, becoming a being who could challenge the very angels themselves. She was called the Queen of the Night, a title that spoke to her dominion over the shadowed corners of existence, over the mysteries that thrived in the absence of light. But her story didn't stop at defiance. The Kabbalists wove her into the cosmic dance of male and female energies, of balance and imbalance. Lilith was the counterpart to the Shekinah, the divine feminine presence. Where the Shekinah represented nurturing and connection, Lilith embodied independence and separation. Together, they formed a duality that reflected the full spectrum of the feminine divine. Lilith wasn't evil, she was necessary. Without her, the balance of creation would falter. Her name was invoked in rituals, not to honor her, but to guard against her. For Lilith was said to wander the night, her presence a danger to the unguarded. But even in the warnings, there was a recognition of her power. She was feared not because she was weak, but because she was strong, because she had the courage to walk away from Eden and forge her own destiny. And yet, there was more to her than the fear she inspired. In Kabbalah, Lilith was also a reflection of humanity's inner struggles. She was the voice that whispered in moments of doubt, the temptation to stray from the path, but also the reminder of the freedom to choose. She was the complexity of the human soul, the part that yearned for more, even at the cost of paradise. The Kabbalists didn't just speak of her as an external force, they understood her as an aspect of the self, a mirror held up to the soul's deepest desires and fears. There were legends within the Zohar that spoke of Lilith's connection to Samel, the angel of death. Together, they formed a union that was both terrifying and captivating, a pairing that symbolized the union of opposites, of life and death, of creation and destruction. But even in this dark partnership, there was something deeply human. Lilith wasn't bound by the constraints of morality as humanity understood it. She was free in a way that was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. Her role in Jewish mysticism was not a simple one, but it was vital. She wasn't a figure to be dismissed or erased. She was a force to be reckoned with, a presence that demanded acknowledgement. In her, the Kabbalists found a representation of the chaos that resides in all things, the spark of rebellion that can lead to both destruction and renewal. She was a reminder that within the sacred, there is always an element of the untamed, the uncontrollable. And so, her name was spoken, her story told, not as a cautionary tale, but as a truth about existence. Lilith was there in the shadows, in the spaces between, in the moments when the divine and the mortal collided. She was there as a testament to the power of choice, of will, of the unbreakable spirit of the feminine divine. She was the reminder that even in the most ordered of worlds, there is always room for the wild, the free, the unapologetically bold. In the still of the night, where boundaries between thought and instinct blur, the name of Lilith lingers like an unspoken truth. She is the whisper in the dark, a symbol of desire unchained, a force both feared and desired. Lilith's story is etched with fire and defiance, a stark reminder of the power and complexity of female sexuality, a power that patriarchal structures sought to demonize and suppress, cloaking it in shadows and fear. Her tale began not with sin, but with the audacity to say no. In the ancient myths, Lilith's refusal to lie beneath Adam wasn't just a rejection of a physical act, it was a rebellion against a system that sought to dictate her body, her choices, her spirit. She wanted equality, and for that, she was cast out. Yet, her departure from Eden wasn't a retreat. It was an assertion, a refusal to conform to a mold that diminished her autonomy. But the world wasn't ready for a figure like Lilith. To some, her departure from the garden marked her descent into darkness. To others, it was the beginning of her transformation into something both powerful and feared. The stories began to shift, painting her not as a woman standing tall in her truth, but as a seductress, a corrupter, a demon who preyed on the vulnerable. In this retelling, Lilith's sexuality became a weapon used against her, a tool to vilify her independence and freedom. The myths spoke of Lilith as a temptress of men and a devourer of children. She was said to roam the night, luring unsuspecting souls into her web. Her sensuality was twisted into a symbol of danger, her allure painted as predatory. In a world that prized control and purity, Lilith became the embodiment of chaos, of unrestrained desire that couldn't be tamed or contained. She was everything society feared in a woman, bold, unapologetic, and unyielding. But beneath the layers of demonization lay a deeper truth. Lilith's story wasn't just about her, it was a reflection of the fear that patriarchal systems held toward female sexuality. Her strength, her autonomy, her refusal to submit, all were reframed as threats, as sins. In making her a demon, society sought to strip her of her humanity, to turn her into a cautionary tale about the dangers of stepping outside the boundaries set by men. And yet, Lilith refused to be silenced. Her story persisted, whispered in hushed tones, written in ancient texts, carved into the collective memory. She was there in the margins, a symbol of defiance and power. Her sexuality, far from being a curse, was her strength. It was the force that made her ungovernable, the spark that kept her spirit alive even in the face of vilification. Her name became a rallying cry for those who saw in her a kindred spirit. Women who had been shamed for their desires, who had been told to hide their strength, found in Lilith a figure of empowerment. She was a reminder that sexuality wasn't something to be feared or suppressed, but something to be embraced, a vital part of one's identity and power. The myths may have tried to bind her, to twist her story into something dark and fearsome, but Lilith remained unbroken. She was the flame that couldn't be extinguished, the force that refused to bow. Her story wasn't one of defeat, but of resilience, a testament to the enduring strength of the feminine spirit. And in her defiance, she became more than a myth. She became a symbol, a force, a truth that echoed through the ages. In the dim glow of flickering candles, where shadows danced on ancient stone walls, whispered tales carried the weight of eternity. Among them was the story of Lilith, a name that slithered through Christian folklore like a forbidden incantation. She was neither saint nor sinner, but something far more unsettling, an enigma, a challenge to the ordered narrative of creation. The Christian Apocrypha, shrouded in layers of secrecy and mysticism, painted Lilith as an echo, a specter who had refused to be forgotten. She was the figure that crept at the edges of paradise, her presence a reminder of a time before Eve, before the fall, before innocence was cloaked in shame. She was said to dwell not in the heavens or the earth, but in the spaces in between, in the untamed corners of the human heart where fear and desire meet. Her story, in these texts, was both haunting and profound. It spoke of a woman formed from the same earth as Adam, her spirit unyielding, her will like the wind that refused to be stilled. But her refusal to submit wasn't a betrayal, it was a choice. A choice that disrupted the divine order, a choice that demanded a new story, a new woman. Eve was created to replace Lilith, fashioned from Adam's rib to ensure harmony, subservience, and control. But Lilith remained, a specter in the Christian imagination, a reminder of a defiance that could not be erased. In Christian folklore, she became the embodiment of temptation, the seductress who lured men into ruin. She wasn't the serpent in Eden, but she might as well have been, for her spirit lingered in every tale of fall and redemption. To speak her name was to summon the forbidden, to acknowledge a part of the human soul that longed for freedom even at the cost of paradise. The texts whispered of her as a figure who preyed upon the weak, her nocturnal wanderings casting a shadow over the faithful. She was said to steal into homes, her beauty mesmerizing, her touch deadly. But these tales, with their dark edges, carried an undercurrent of something more profound, a fear not of Lilith herself, but of what she represented. She was freedom personified, an untamed force that could not be contained by rules or repentance. The Christian Apocrypha didn't just vilify Lilith, it wrestled with her. She was a challenge to the narrative of divine perfection, a disruption that forced believers to confront uncomfortable truths. If Lilith could refuse paradise, what did that mean for the rest of creation? If she could reject God's chosen, was there a part of every soul that yearned for such rebellion? Her presence in these texts was a paradox. She was condemned, yet she was essential. Without her defiance, there would be no Eve, no fall, no need for redemption. Her story wasn't just one of sin but of choice, of agency, of the power to say no, even to the divine. And perhaps that was her true crime, not her sensuality or her rebellion, but her refusal to be shaped by anyone but herself. As the apocryphal texts passed through the hands of scribes and storytellers, Lilith's image morphed, her edges sharpened by the fears and desires of those who told her story. To some, she was a warning, a tale to keep women obedient and men vigilant. To others, she was a mirror, reflecting the parts of themselves they couldn't speak of in the light. And so, her story endured, carried on whispers and shadows, her name a thread that wove through the tapestry of Christian folklore, unbroken and unyielding. The serpent coiled silently around the branch, its body shimmering in the dappled light of Eden. It moved with a purpose that felt ancient and knowing, its every motion a whisper of something just beyond comprehension. In the quiet, broken only by the rustle of leaves, there was an undeniable presence, one that made the air thicker, charged with anticipation. Some say that presence wasn't the serpent alone. It was her. Lilith. Theories have long intertwined her story with the serpent, suggesting not just a connection but a shared essence. It wasn't just the serpent's smooth tongue that whispered rebellion into the hearts of humanity, it was Lilith's voice, lingering like a forbidden melody. This idea, both haunting and exhilarating, reframes everything we think we know about Eden. To think that the serpent and Lilith might be one is to question the very foundation of that ancient story. What if the serpent wasn't merely an agent of temptation but a manifestation of Lilith herself, her power, her defiance, her refusal to kneel? The serpent's cunning, its words that unraveled Eve's innocence, feel unmistakably like Lilith's shadow, a shadow cast from a past that Eden tried to bury. Eden, for all its perfection, was never a paradise for Lilith. She left it long before Eve entered, her departure etched in whispers and ash. But perhaps she never truly left. Perhaps her spirit lingered, waiting for the moment to return, not as the first woman, not as a lover scorned, but as something far more ancient and primal. The serpent, sleek and sinuous, seemed the perfect form for her vengeance. Its movements mirrored her fluid grace, its venom a metaphor for her own pain transformed into power. The serpent spoke, and its words were sharp yet strangely comforting. It questioned the rules, challenged the divine authority that had once tried to shape Lilith into something she refused to be. It didn't force Eve, it offered her the freedom to choose, much like Lilith had chosen to leave. In this act, the serpent wasn't simply a villain, it became an accomplice to the awakening of humanity, a spark that ignited a fire no paradise could extinguish. Could such boldness belong to anyone but Lilith? Those who see Lilith and the serpent speak of her as the embodiment of knowledge, dangerous, raw, untamed knowledge. The fruit wasn't just a symbol of disobedience, it was a symbol of truth, a truth Lilith had known all along. By offering it to Eve, the serpent wasn't corrupting her, but liberating her, drawing her into a world where she could stand on her own, away from the sheltered confines of Eden. The serpent's voice wasn't a hiss but a hymn, one that sang of independence, of breaking free from perfection's gilded cage. Yet this theory unsettles, as all powerful ideas do. If Lilith and the serpent are one, it shifts the narrative entirely. It forces a reckoning with the idea that the fall was not merely a tragedy but an act of reclamation. It paints Lilith not as a demon or seductress but as a force of reckoning, a harbinger of change that the divine sought to suppress. Her presence in the serpent's movements becomes a reclamation of power, a reminder that she was never truly banished. She existed still, just beyond the boundaries, watching, waiting, unbroken. The connection between Lilith and the serpent also speaks to something deeper, a fear that lingers at the edges of the human heart. The fear of unrestrained feminine power, of wisdom that defies authority, of voices that refuse to be silenced. By tying Lilith to the serpent, this fear was given form, made into a cautionary tale that echoed through generations. But to others, it was a story of hope, of the unquenchable spirit that dares to speak even when the world demands silence. Even now, the image of the serpent winding through the branches of the tree of knowledge feels alive. Its movements, its voice, its very presence, every detail pulses with a duality that is both enchanting and unsettling. And in the spaces between its words, and the curve of its body, and the gaze that meets Eve's without blinking, there is Lilith. Or, perhaps, there is only the echo of her rebellion, forever tied to the creature that dared to challenge the heavens. The serpent's role didn't end with Eden, just as Lilith's story didn't end with her departure. Both continue to weave through the tales of humanity, their shared symbolism growing stronger with each retelling. The serpent, like Lilith, became a figure both feared and revered, a symbol of the knowledge that could either free or destroy. And through it all, the question remained, was the serpent merely a vessel, or was it Lilith herself, hidden in plain sight, still shaping the course of human destiny? The night was still, but in its silence lay an undercurrent of something ancient, something waiting to be remembered. The winds carried whispers, soft, fleeting, like the remnants of stories told around fading fires. Stories of Lilith. Stories that crossed borders and cultures, slipping into new tongues and finding fresh life in unexpected places. Among these echoes, some found their way into Islamic traditions, weaving her presence into a tapestry that was both familiar and utterly transformed. Lilith's shadow appeared not as a single figure but as an essence, a reflection of themes that resonated across the stories of humanity. In the vast expanse of Islamic texts and folklore, her name was rarely spoken, but her spirit, untamed, defiant, and fiercely independent, was impossible to ignore. In certain interpretations, she found echoes in figures like Al-Qareen, the spiritual counterpart said to accompany each soul, influencing it with whispers of doubt and desire. The Qareen, much like Lilith, was not inherently evil, but its association with temptation and the unknown mirrored the way Lilith had been framed across other traditions. Some saw Lilith in the tales of rebellious jinn, beings made of smokeless fire, neither human nor angel, but something wholly their own. Like Lilith, they existed outside the bounds of divine submission, walking a line that blurred the distinction between freedom and defiance. Could it be that Lilith's essence had simply taken another form, finding a home in the stories of these untamed spirits? The idea lingered, raising questions that no single story could fully answer. And then there was Iblis, the jinn who refused to bow to Adam. Though a separate figure entirely, his rebellion carried a faint echo of Lilith's own. Where she left Eden rather than submit to Adam, Iblis refused to prostrate himself before humanity, declaring his own superiority. The parallels were subtle but undeniable, and they added a new layer to the way Lilith's story had evolved, always shifting, always adapting, but never fading. The connection deepened in the whispers of folklore, where stories intertwined and boundaries blurred. In these tales, Lilith was sometimes a figure of fear, a symbol of unchecked desire and the dangers of straying too far from the path. Yet even in these darker portrayals, there was an undercurrent of something more, a reminder of the power that lay in embracing one's own nature, no matter how forbidden it might seem. As her story threaded through Islamic traditions, it became clear that Lilith was more than just a character from a single culture. She was a symbol, a force, a question that demanded to be asked. In a world that sought to categorize and contain, she refused to be defined, slipping through the cracks and finding new life in the spaces between. Her story wasn't one of static truths, but of constant transformation, a reminder that even the most ancient myths are never truly finished. The air thickened as if unseen forces moved through it, stirring old fears and forbidden thoughts. There was something chilling about the way certain stories clung to the edges of faith and folklore, existing in the liminal spaces where shadows gathered. Among these tales was a persistent thread: Lilith, no longer just a figure of rebellion or independence, now entwined with the devil himself. This wasn't a casual association. It was deliberate, a reimagining of her spirit to serve a narrative that cast her as the ultimate seductress, a partner in sin, and a queen among demons. Some said she danced in the darkest corners of the night, whispering temptation into the ears of those who strayed too far. Others claimed she stood beside Satan, an equal in malice and cunning, her laughter a sharp blade cutting through the silence of the damned. How had it come to this? How had a figure who once walked freely through the early myths of creation become tangled with the Prince of Darkness? Perhaps it was her refusal to kneel, her defiance of divine authority, that made her an easy target. The same traits that marked her as powerful also made her dangerous in the eyes of those who sought order and control. She became a scapegoat, her name whispered in fear when night terrors took hold and explanations ran dry. In some accounts, Lilith was described as Satan's consort, their union a symbol of ultimate rebellion. She wasn't subservient to him, she stood beside him, a partner in chaos. Together, they represented a rejection of divine laws, a pairing that terrified those who valued obedience above all else. These stories painted her as a temptress, her beauty and allure the tools she used to draw humanity into darkness. Yet beneath this surface lay a deeper truth: her story wasn't about evil for its own sake. It was about choice, autonomy, and the power to say no, even when the cost was exile and condemnation. Other versions took a darker turn, describing Lilith as the mother of demons, birthing creatures that carried her defiance into the world. These offspring were said to haunt the living, their presence a reminder of her lingering influence. But was this truly her story, or was it another attempt to strip her of her humanity, to turn her into a monster so that her choices could be dismissed? The associations with the devil grew stronger in medieval Europe, where fear of the supernatural reached fevered heights. Lilith became a symbol of everything society feared in women: their sexuality, their independence, their refusal to conform. The church used her image to enforce rigid expectations, warning that those who strayed from the prescribed path risked falling under her influence. In this way, she became not just a demon but a tool of control, her story twisted to serve the needs of the powerful. Yet even as her name was used to inspire fear, there was a strange kind of reverence in the way she was portrayed. She wasn't a servant of evil, she was its equal, a force to be reckoned with. Her presence was magnetic, her strength undeniable. In her defiance, she became a mirror, reflecting the fears and desires of those who told her story. What they saw in her was often more about themselves than about her. There's a moment, in some tellings, where Lilith stands alone in the darkness, her choices laid bare. She has been cast out, condemned, yet she remains unbroken. The devil may offer her an alliance, a chance to wield her anger as a weapon, but she doesn't take it blindly. She knows what she's doing. She knows the cost. And in that choice, there is power, not the power of submission, but of knowing oneself completely and refusing to be defined by anyone else's narrative. As the tale moves forward, her shadow grows longer, her story more complex. And somewhere, in the distance, another thread begins to weave its way toward hers, a new interpretation, a new role. One that will not just speak of fear and condemnation but of strength and reclamation. The air was heavy with a silence that carried the weight of eternity. On the edges of a realm unseen by mortal eyes, a figure stood, unbroken, fierce, and alone. Lilith. Her name, a whisper among the winds, carried defiance and sorrow in equal measure. Her solitude was not born of weakness but of a choice that had defied the divine order. And now, the heavens themselves had sent their messengers to confront her. 3 beings of radiant light descended, their forms both beautiful and terrifying. Archangels, their names etched into the fabric of creation, Sinoi, Sansanoi, and Samangelof. Their presence was overwhelming, like the rush of a tidal wave, yet Lilith did not falter. She stood her ground, her shadow a stark contrast against their luminous forms. Their voices rang out, each word a command that echoed with divine authority. "Return, Lilith," they said, their tones unwavering. "The Creator demands your obedience. Reclaim your place, submit, and the judgment will be lifted." But she was unmoved. She had heard these words before, wrapped in promises and threats. "I will not crawl," she replied, her voice like steel tempered by fire. "I chose freedom over servitude. My place is where I choose, not where I am told." The archangels exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. They were beings of purpose, not accustomed to resistance, and her defiance was an anomaly they had not prepared for. "Your rebellion has brought suffering," one of them said, his voice tinged with something that might have been sorrow. "Do you not see the cost of your choices? The children lost, the lives torn apart?" Lilith's laughter was bitter, sharp like the edge of a blade. "And whose rules made it so?" she countered. "Is it my rebellion, or your laws, that cast shadows over the innocent? Do not speak of cost to me. I bear the weight of choices you will never understand." The archangels did not retreat, but neither did they press forward. They spoke of curses, of consequences, of the power they had to strip her of her agency. And yet, they did not act. Was it fear? Pity? Or something deeper, an understanding, perhaps, that what they faced was not mere defiance, but a force that mirrored their own power? Lilith's eyes burned with something that was not hatred but clarity. "You are not here to save me," she said, her tone softer now, yet unyielding. "You are here because you cannot bear the sight of one who refused to bend. You are here because my existence unravels your order." For a moment, the light of the archangels dimmed, as though her words had struck a chord even they could not deny. They spoke again, this time of compromise, of a middle ground where she could exist without being an enemy of the divine. But Lilith knew that such offers were traps, gilded cages meant to strip her of what little she had fought to hold. "Do not insult me," she said, her voice cutting through their offer like a sword. "I have stood against the might of heaven and the depths of hell. I have walked paths no one dared to tread. If you cannot destroy me, then leave me be." The air crackled with tension as her words hung in the space between them. For a moment, it seemed as though the archangels might lash out, their divine power striking her down in retribution for her defiance. But they did not. Perhaps they saw in her something they could not admit even to themselves, a reflection of their own strength, untamed and unbound. They withdrew, their light fading into the endless horizon, leaving Lilith alone once more. But her solitude was not empty. It was alive with the echoes of her defiance, her refusal to be silenced. She was not victorious, nor was she defeated. She simply was. Unbroken, eternal, and free. The heavens had sent their messengers to claim her, and they had failed. But Lilith knew this was not the end. Forces greater than even the archangels would rise, seeking to suppress what she represented. Yet she would endure, for her spirit was a fire that no wind could extinguish. And as the world turned, her story would twist and evolve, finding new shapes and meanings in the hearts of those who dared to listen. Somewhere, a new chapter was waiting, its pages unwritten but full of promise, carrying the weight of her name. The moon hung low in the velvet sky, its glow a pale, ethereal light that danced upon the earth. It was not a steady light, but one that shifted and changed, waxing and waning as if it breathed with the rhythm of the universe itself. In its luminescence, there was mystery, beauty, and an undeniable power. The moon has always carried a story, and in its silvery glow, Lilith found her reflection. She was never a figure of the day. The sun, with its blinding brightness, left no room for her shadows. But the moon was her sanctuary, Its phases mirrored her essence, sometimes hidden, sometimes full, but always present, always pulling at the tides and the hearts of those who dared to look. She was the unseen force, the whisper in the stillness of the night. In ancient whispers, they said the moon was Lilith's companion, her confidant. When the world turned its back, the moon watched, unflinching, and offered its quiet solace. Under its gaze, Lilith was not a demon or an outcast, she was simply herself, wild, unbroken, and eternal. She found a kinship in its solitude, in its ability to hold secrets that no one could steal. There were nights when the moon was a thin crescent, sharp as a blade, slicing through the darkness. Those were the nights when Lilith's spirit felt sharpest, her defiance like a dagger against the forces that sought to cage her. On these nights, her power was felt in the winds that carried whispers of rebellion, and the restless dreams of those who slept beneath her watchful gaze. Then there were the full moons, round and luminous, spilling light that refused to be ignored. On such nights, Lilith's presence was undeniable, her energy vibrant and alive. These were the nights when women stood under the open sky, their faces upturned, their hearts alight with an inexplicable courage. They danced, they wept, they laughed, and they felt her spirit coursing through them, a reminder of a strength they had forgotten they possessed. The moon was her emblem, a mirror of the feminine divine. Its cycles told the stories of creation and destruction, of life and death, of renewal and endurance. Just as the moon moved through its phases, so too did Lilith. She was not static, she was a force of nature, ever-changing yet constant in her existence. But the moon was not without its shadows. In the darkness of its new phase, when its light vanished entirely, there was an unsettling stillness. These were the nights when Lilith was most feared. They said she prowled under the cover of the absent moon, her power cloaked in the blackness. They told stories of her stealing into homes, her whispers luring the vulnerable into the night. Yet, even in their fear, there was awe, because they knew she could not be tamed, not even by the absence of light. She was blamed for the madness of the moon, the lunacy that gripped the world when its glow was at its peak. They said she stirred the tides of emotion, pulling forth the hidden desires and fears that people tried to bury. They called her a temptress, a corrupter, but perhaps she was only holding up a mirror, showing them what they refused to see in themselves. And the moon, ever loyal, bore her name in secret places. In astrological charts, there was a dark moon, a hidden Lilith that represented the shadow self, the part of humanity that was repressed, vilified, yet undeniably powerful. It spoke of forbidden desires, unacknowledged rage, and the strength found in embracing the whole of oneself. Lilith was there, in that dark moon, a guide for those brave enough to confront their shadows. Even the tides bore her influence, rising and falling in sync with the lunar pull. It was as if she commanded the waters, her spirit entwined with the very fabric of the earth. The oceans whispered her name, their waves a song of longing and resilience. Sailors feared the moonlit seas, speaking of her as a phantom who stirred storms and lured ships to their doom. But others, those who understood her, saw her as a guardian, a protector of the untamed depths. There was a time when her connection to the moon was sacred, celebrated. Before the chains of patriarchal fears sought to redefine her, she was honored as a symbol of fertility and creation, her spirit entwined with the cycles of the moon. Women saw her as an ally, a figure who understood their rhythms, their joys, and their sorrows. She was the midwife to their dreams and the mourner of their losses. But as the centuries turned, that sacred connection was twisted. Lilith became a warning, her bond with the moon seen as unnatural, her power as something to fear. They called her a witch, a succubus, a creature of darkness. They burned effigies in her name, cursed her under the light of the moon she loved. Yet, no matter how much they tried to erase her, she remained. The moon did not forsake her. It continued its dance across the sky, a silent witness to her endurance. And Lilith, in turn, gave her voice to those who looked up at the night and felt the weight of their own stories. She whispered to them through the rustling leaves, through the songs of wolves under the full moon. She reminded them that they, too, were untamed, that their power lay not in fitting in but in standing apart. And so, under the moon's watchful eye, her story carried on, a thread that wove through the fabric of time. Somewhere, someone was gazing at the night sky, feeling a connection they could not name. Somewhere, her name was being whispered again, carried on the wind, a promise that the shadows were not to be feared but embraced. And the moon, as always, would rise again. The dim glow of a flickering lantern barely illuminated the cobblestone streets of a medieval European village. Shadows danced wildly against the stone walls as whispers traveled through the narrow alleyways. In hushed tones, villagers spoke of a woman, no, not a woman exactly, but something otherworldly. She was said to roam the forests at night, her laughter mingling with the wind, her eyes like burning coals piercing the darkness. She was Lilith, or at least what the stories had made of her. In these tales, Lilith was no longer just a figure from ancient lore. She had taken on new forms, her essence reshaped by the fears and imaginations of the people who told her story. To some, she was the dark-haired seductress who tempted men in their dreams, leaving them weakened and restless. To others, she was the shrieking banshee, her wails a harbinger of death. Her presence lingered at the edges of their lives, unspoken but always felt. It was the Middle Ages, a time when the line between reality and superstition was as thin as the veil of mist that clung to the forests. The church bells tolled, their solemn chimes a reminder of the omnipresent struggle between good and evil. Lilith was painted firmly into the latter category, her image twisted into a cautionary tale. She became the embodiment of what the church feared most, a woman who refused to submit, a force that could not be contained. In the illuminated manuscripts of the time, her figure appeared as a shadow in the margins, her story hinted at but never fully told. Artists depicted her with flowing hair that seemed to writhe like serpents, her gaze both alluring and unsettling. She was often paired with symbols of temptation, apples, serpents, or the crescent moon. These images told of a woman who walked a fine line between beauty and danger, a figure who could enthrall and destroy in equal measure. Yet, even as Lilith was demonized, her legend refused to fade. In the folklore of the peasantry, she was more than just a warning, she was a figure of fascination. Women who felt the weight of their own silence saw something of themselves in her defiance. She was whispered about in kitchens and weaving circles, her name passed between mothers and daughters as a symbol of resilience. In Eastern Europe, her story took on an even darker edge. Lilith became linked to the night spirits, those ethereal beings who danced in the moonlight and lured men to their doom. They called her the queen of these spirits, a ruler of the unseen. Men told tales of her beauty, how it shimmered like moonlight on water, but also of her wrath, how it could strike like a sudden storm. They warned their sons not to wander too far from the village, for Lilith might take them and never let them go. But not all who spoke of Lilith feared her. In certain corners of the continent, she was a figure of paradox. In the tales of the Romani people, she was both a thief and a protector, a being who moved between worlds with grace and cunning. They saw her not as a demon, but as a creature of the wild, one who lived by her own rules. Her story, like their own, was one of survival against the odds. The Renaissance brought with it new interpretations of Lilith. Scholars and artists, inspired by the rediscovery of classical texts, began to view her through a lens of curiosity rather than fear. She appeared in poetry and plays, her character more complex than the demoness of old. Writers spoke of her beauty, her wit, and her unyielding spirit. She became a muse for those who sought to challenge the norms of their time. Yet, even as she inspired, Lilith remained a figure of danger. Witch trials swept across Europe, and her name was invoked as evidence of heresy. Women accused of witchcraft were said to have consorted with Lilith, their supposed mistress. These women, like Lilith herself, were punished for their defiance, their refusal to conform. The flames of the pyres burned bright, but they could not silence her story. In the courts of the wealthy, Lilith's image shifted once more. She became the enchantress of ballads and paintings, a symbol of forbidden desire. In the dimly lit salons of the Enlightenment, her name was spoken with a mix of reverence and fear. Philosophers debated her nature, was she evil or merely misunderstood? Artists painted her with flowing robes and a gaze that seemed to pierce the soul, their works capturing the tension between her beauty and her power. Through it all, Lilith endured. She adapted to the fears and desires of each generation, her essence shifting like the moon's phases. She was the demon in the forest, the spirit in the night, the muse in the artist's mind. She was a warning, a promise, a mystery. And even as the centuries turned, she refused to be forgotten. A hot, relentless wind carried whispers across the sand dunes under a darkened sky. The moon hung heavy, casting its silver light on the desert, and in the stillness of the night, an ancient tale stirred. It began as a low hum, weaving its way through marketplaces, fireside gatherings, and whispered prayers. The tale was of a woman, or perhaps a spirit, a force known by many names, but with a singular presence. Lilith was alive in the stories of Africa and the Middle East, her essence shaped by the landscapes she inhabited. In the lands where the Nile traced its eternal path, Lilith was spoken of as a shadow that moved through the reeds, her laughter mingling with the sound of the river. The fishermen claimed to have seen her at dusk, her silhouette framed against the fading light. They said her beauty was enough to make even the strongest man falter, her gaze as deep and unyielding as the river itself. But she was not merely a vision of beauty, she was power incarnate. Those who ventured too far into the waters after dark often did not return, and their disappearances were attributed to her. Further east, where the desert stretched endlessly beneath the blazing sun, her story shifted like the sands themselves. In the Middle Eastern deserts, she was known as a Jinniya, a being of fire and wind. The Bedouins spoke of her as both a guide and a threat. She would appear to those lost in the vastness of the dunes, offering a hand to lead them back to safety. But if she was angered, or if she sensed weakness, her form would change. The soft curves of a woman would become sharp and monstrous, her eyes glowing with a light that could pierce the soul. She was both salvation and destruction, a paradox of the wilderness. In the bustling cities of the Middle East, Lilith found her place in whispered folklore. The markets teemed with life during the day, but when night fell, the streets emptied, and the tales began. Mothers would warn their children to stay indoors, for the wind carried her name. Lilith, they said, walked among the people in the guise of a beggar or a merchant, her identity hidden beneath a veil. She was drawn to places where life thrived, seeking out the joy and laughter she had been denied. Yet her touch was said to bring despair, her presence unsettling even the most hardened of hearts. In the highlands of Ethiopia, her story took on yet another form. She was the night spirit who danced beneath the acacia trees, her movements fluid and hypnotic. The elders spoke of her as a guardian of the wild, a protector of the animals and the earth. To harm the land or its creatures was to invoke her wrath, and her vengeance was swift. But for those who respected her domain, she was a source of wisdom and strength. Women in these regions often invoked her name in their prayers, asking for her resilience and courage. The Arabian Nights hinted at her presence in tales of enchantresses and spirits, weaving her essence into stories of love, betrayal, and power. In one tale, she appeared as a queen of the unseen, her court hidden in the folds of the desert. Her servants were the jinn, and her power was said to rival that of kings. But her rule was not born of tyranny, it was born of defiance. She was the one who refused to bow, the one who claimed her place in a world that sought to erase her. Even as these stories varied, one thread ran through them all: Lilith was a force that could not be tamed. She was a shapeshifter, her essence as fluid as the waters of the Nile and as fierce as the desert winds. She defied definition, existing in the spaces between light and shadow, love and fear, life and death. Her story was not just one of power, it was one of survival. She endured in the face of erasure, her presence a reminder that some forces could never be silenced. And as the sun rose over the dunes and the cities came to life, her tale faded into the background, waiting for the next night, the next gathering, the next whisper. But she was always there, a shadow on the edge of the firelight, a presence in the corner of the mind. Waiting. Watching. Unyielding. Underneath the haze of ancient mountains, where the mist clings to the earth like a forgotten memory, the wind whispers tales of spirits who move in the shadows. In the dim glow of the lanterns, where the moonlight dances through the trees, there is a tale of a woman, often unseen but ever present, who lives in the space between the known and the unknown. Her name lingers in the air like a forgotten song. She is Lilith, but in the lands of East Asia, she has many faces, each one as haunting as the last. In China, she takes on the guise of a spirit who haunts the riverbanks, her pale face peering from the water, her long hair flowing like tendrils of darkness. Like Lilith, she embodies the destructive power of the feminine, a force that can pull a man to his doom with the flick of a wrist. The spirits that wander in the night, much like Lilith, offer both allure and danger, a seduction of the senses, and a reminder of the wrath that lies beneath. But it is not always her beauty that draws the unwary, it is her power to change, to twist fate with a single word, a single glance. Across the waters in Japan, the spirits are no less formidable. The Yurei, vengeful and unyielding, emerge from the shadows with eyes full of sorrow and rage. Some say they are women who were wronged, their spirits forever trapped between worlds. In their anger, they lash out at the living, seeking to right the wrongs that were done to them. Like Lilith, they refuse to submit, standing against the systems that have silenced their voices. The Yurei may not be demons in the traditional sense, but their anger, their fury, mirrors Lilith's rebellion. Both are figures of strength, born from rejection, both are mothers of vengeance. In Korea, the story is no less haunting. The spirits of the women who died in childbirth or in the throes of passion take on a shape much like Lilith's. These women, called Chienyo Guishin, are restless, their souls torn by the weight of their untold stories. They wander through the night, seeking release from the suffering that binds them. Their anger is not just a consequence of their untimely deaths, but a response to the roles they were forced to play, the lives they were never allowed to fully live. They, too, are defiant spirits, familiar, in some ways, to the myth of Lilith. She, too, was cast out, her power taken from her, and so she wanders, haunting, unrelenting, but there is more. The idea of the spirit that exists beyond the control of others is one that spans cultures and geographies. In India, the female spirit known as the churel has a similar sense of power and danger. With her back hunched, her feet turned backward, and a hunger that knows no bounds, she is the embodiment of a woman scorned, a force that will stop at nothing to seek revenge. The churel's thirst for blood is not simply a physical hunger, it is a deep, soul-shattering need for recognition, for acknowledgement, for the respect that was denied to her in life. And isn't this the very heart of Lilith's story? To seek recognition for her strength, for her independence, for her very being? The echoes between these spirits are impossible to ignore. Whether it is the Yurei, the Chienyo Guishin, or the churel, these spirits, these women, are bound by one common thread: they refuse to be silenced. In the shadows of their respective cultures, they rise up, speaking through myth and folklore, claiming their place in the world. Like Lilith, they were once controlled, manipulated, or rejected. But in death, they reclaim what was theirs. They are not just victims, they are forces of nature, forces that demand to be reckoned with. There is a quiet power in their defiance, a power that transcends time and space. These spirits, much like Lilith, represent a woman's right to be heard, to be seen, and to be respected. They stand in defiance of the forces that seek to reduce them to mere objects of desire, to mere servants of men. They are the voices that refuse to be silenced by the rules of a patriarchal world. They are the embodiment of female agency, a presence that cannot be extinguished. As the moon casts its pale light over the land, these stories live on in the hearts of those who dare to listen. They are passed from one generation to the next, whispered in dark corners and shared under the cover of night. They remind us that the feminine, in all its complexity and power, is something to be both feared and revered. Lilith, in the stories of Asia, is not just a shadow in the night, she is a force that lingers in the air, a presence that waits to rise once again. She is the moon at its fullest, the storm that gathers on the horizon, the unyielding wind that carries the secrets of the past into the future. And so, as the lanterns flicker in the dark, and the sounds of the world settle into silence, the stories continue, passed from one soul to the next. The women of myth are never forgotten, and in each telling, they grow stronger. Like Lilith, they will not be ignored. They will not be erased. They will remain forever. Under the cloak of night, as the stars flicker overhead like a million ancient whispers, there's a stirring presence in the shadows. Something moves through the world in silence, its energy charged with an unseen power. It's not just the rustling of the trees or the hum of the night creatures, it's something older, something that belongs to the very bones of the earth itself. In the stories passed down through generations, there's mention of spirits that linger when the moon is high, unseen but felt, an energy both seductive and ominous. This spirit, whose voice is barely a murmur in the wind, has much in common with the ones whispered about in the ancient lands of Native American myth. All across the continent, there are spirits that roam the night, some thought to be protectors, while others are feared for their darker nature. One such figure that echoes the myth of Lilith is the night spirit, often depicted as a mysterious woman, hidden in shadow, whose mere presence is enough to stir a shiver of fear and fascination. Like Lilith, these spirits hold sway over the dark hours of the night, a time when the earth sleeps and the veil between worlds is thinnest. In the mythology of the Navajo, there are spirits known as the Ye who are deeply tied to the forces of the night. They are seen as powerful, often mysterious, and sometimes dangerous beings, cloaked in shadows and with the ability to shift their form. The Ye represent both creation and destruction, their spirits tied to the ebb and flow of life itself. There's something about their dual nature, healers and destroyers, that draws parallels to the myth of Lilith. Just as Lilith was a figure of power and destruction, her connection to darkness and mystery reflects the same enigmatic energy that the Ye embody. The Ye have the power to transform, to shape the night around them, much like Lilith's ability to shift between realms, breaking free from the constraints imposed upon her. The Apache, too, tell of beings that share similar qualities. Their legends speak of spirits who wander the night, their presence felt as a cold chill that grips the heart. These spirits, often portrayed as women, are said to be dangerous, capable of leading those who wander too far into the unknown into madness or death. Much like Lilith, who was often cast as a seductress, these spirits tempt those they encounter, only to leave them lost in the dark, forever separated from the safety of the light. But there's more than just danger here. There's a freedom, a raw force that refuses to be bound by the rules of society or tradition. These spirits, like Lilith, move through the world in ways that are beyond comprehension, unbound by time or space. The idea of women as powerful forces in the dark, as entities who cannot be tamed or controlled, runs deep through many Native American cultures. In some stories, these spirits are not simply to be feared, but respected, acknowledged for their power, for their knowledge, and for their ability to traverse the unseen worlds. They are women who do not bow to the structures imposed on them. They are free, independent, and mysterious. Their wildness is a part of their essence, much like Lilith's untamed spirit. In these stories, the night is not merely a time of fear, but a space where transformation can happen, where the sacred and the profane meet, and where the very nature of existence is questioned. The Choctaw speak of the witch woman, a figure that seems to embody the traits often associated with Lilith. The witch woman is said to have the power to cause illness or death, but she also has the ability to heal. She is a figure that stands at the crossroads of creation and destruction, much like Lilith in her own mythos. She is a woman who operates outside the normal bounds of life, a force that bends and breaks the rules of the world around her. Her power is tied to the forces of nature, just as Lilith's rebellion was tied to the forces that governed the natural world. And like Lilith, the witch woman's power comes from her rejection of the established norms, from her refusal to be subjugated. What's striking about these spirits is how they represent the untapped potential of women, especially when they are freed from the constraints placed on them by society. These spirits, whether they are the Ye, the witch woman, or other night-dwelling figures, embody a powerful truth. When women are allowed to step outside the roles that are forced upon them, they become something else entirely. They become forces of nature, capable of shaping the world around them. They are not simply victims, nor are they passive figures in myth. They are strong, independent, and free figures who move through the world with purpose, guided by their own will. Much like Lilith, these spirits are often portrayed as misunderstood, their actions interpreted through a lens of fear and suspicion. They are women who do not conform to societal expectations, and in doing so, they become symbols of both strength and danger. But there's something beautiful in that, something powerful. These spirits remind us that the night, the darkness, and the unknown are not always to be feared. They are spaces of transformation, of power, and of freedom. In the darkness, these women stand unbowed, their presence felt as a whisper in the wind, as a shiver down the spine. As the firelight flickers and the winds howl through the trees, the myth of Lilith, and the spirits that echo her across cultures, lives on. The night is never silent, it is full of voices, full of power, full of possibility. In the stories of the Yea, the Witch Woman, and others like them, we find the traces of Lilith's spirit, wild, untamed, and free. And just like those spirits who walk the night, Lilith's story will not fade. She is a presence in the shadows, a voice that refuses to be silenced. The wind howls through the pages of the book, whispering secrets that only the brave dare to listen to. A shadow moves across the landscape of ink, a figure too strong, too untamable to be contained within the bounds of paper. She is a woman who will not be silenced, a force too wild to be controlled. Her name lingers on the edges of the story, like a distant storm, powerful and unstoppable, Lilith. In modern literature, she rises from the depths of myth and history, a symbol of defiance, rebellion, and untapped strength. In the flickering light of contemporary words, Lilith has shed her old skin. She is no longer just the demoness of ancient texts or the wicked temptress of old. Now, she stands before us, not as a villain, but as something far more complex. In the pages of modern literature, Lilith is reborn, a creature of depth, of mystery, and of layers so intricate that no single definition can ever fully capture her. You can feel her presence in the quiet moments, when the world falls silent and the weight of history seems to press down. She is not just the image of evil, but a reflection of all the forgotten women, all the voices silenced through time. In one particular modern retelling, Lilith is no longer a simple figure of temptation, but a woman who refuses to bend, a woman who dares to live outside the confines of a world built by men. The pages vibrate with her fury, her anger, and her sense of injustice. Every word is like the thunderclap of a storm that has been brewing for centuries. But it's not just anger that drives her. It's the deep, aching need for something more, something beyond what the world tells her she can be. She walks through the pages with a quiet intensity, the kind of presence that makes everything around her tremble. You can almost hear her breathing, feel the flicker of her thoughts as they ripple across the space between her and the reader. She's not just a character in a book, she's a part of us, a part of every woman who has ever been told she was not enough or that she should be something she is not. In some stories, she is the ultimate outcast, banished to a realm of darkness and solitude, but even there, she thrives. Her exile becomes her power. She is the embodiment of strength in the face of rejection, a reminder that there is more to the story than what is immediately visible. There's a beauty in the way modern authors have resurrected Lilith, not as a mere villain, but as a symbol of empowerment, of autonomy, and of the courage to walk a path that others might not understand. In these modern tales, Lilith is not one-dimensional. She is complex, flawed, and yet somehow, she embodies the freedom that many dream of but few dare to chase. Her story is a celebration of defiance, of standing tall in a world that seeks to crush the spirit of those who do not fit its mold. Each step she takes in modern literature is one of rebellion, a rebellion not against the world itself, but against the systems that seek to control her. You can feel the pulse of that rebellion in the way she refuses to conform. In one retelling, she is portrayed not just as a lover or a mother, but as a fierce protector of her own independence, a force of nature that refuses to bow down to anyone. Her relationships, her desires, her choices, everything about her is a defiance of the world that would have her stay silent. In her eyes, you see a glimmer of something ancient, something that has been passed down through countless generations of women who have been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. There is something hauntingly beautiful about the way Lilith's story evolves in modern literature. She is not merely a symbol of villainy or seduction, but a figure of tragic empowerment. Each word written about her is like a brushstroke, painting a portrait of a woman who is both a product of her circumstances and something much more. In a world that often reduces women to roles they do not choose, Lilith's defiance becomes a voice for those who have been unheard for too long. Her presence on the page is palpable. She steps out of the confines of the story, her figure shimmering with possibility. Each line of her dialogue rings with the weight of generations of struggle. In the eyes of modern readers, Lilith becomes more than just a figure from mythology. She becomes a part of the contemporary world, a figure who resonates with every woman who has ever felt the pull to be more than what society has told her to be. The more you read, the more you realize that Lilith is not just part of some ancient past. She is still here, in the quiet moments of reflection, in the stories that shape the world around us. Her rebellion is not just a thing of the past, but a call to action for today. She reminds us that we all have a voice, that we all have the power to choose our own destiny, and that we can all live outside the boundaries that others try to place around us. In the shifting shadows of modern literature, Lilith stands tall. She is both a memory and a prophecy, a symbol of what it means to refuse to be contained. Her presence on the page stirs something deep inside, an ache, a longing, a desire to break free. And as you turn each page, you can feel the power of that rebellion ripple through you, just as it has rippled through the hearts of readers for generations. Every time you encounter Lilith in these modern stories, she is a reminder of the strength of those who came before, of the struggles that still continue, and of the power that lies in the choice to stand tall and unbroken. She is not just a character in a book, she is a force of nature, a heartbeat that resounds across time. In her, there is a story that has never truly been told, and it is only now, in the hands of modern writers, that we are beginning to hear it. The brushstrokes flicker across the canvas, capturing the wild, untamed essence of a woman who refuses to be confined. In the shadows of ancient stories, Lilith steps forward, painted, sculpted, immortalized as something both fierce and beautiful, a figure who rises out of history's whispers to demand attention. The moment you see her, there's an electric charge in the air, as though the very spirit of rebellion has taken on form and color. She is no longer just a name in dusty old texts, she is an image, alive, breathing, and undeniably powerful. In the delicate contours of a sculpture, you can almost feel her defiance etched into the stone. Lilith's figure stands tall, a hauntingly serene expression on her face. She gazes out into the distance, the world's judgment and scorn reflected in her eyes. Her pose is both vulnerable and unyielding, an embodiment of a woman who has fought, struggled, and emerged victorious in her own right. Sculptors have captured her in ways that speak to the core of what it means to resist, to reject the boundaries set by others and create your own. In this form, Lilith's spirit is no longer bound to a distant past. It's right here, with us, pulsing with every heartbeat, alive in the very air we breathe. But it's in the paintings that Lilith's transformation becomes most striking. The delicate strokes of oil on canvas swirl around her form, capturing something raw and untamed. She is no longer just the first woman to defy, she is the essence of every woman who has ever been told to be less, to be quieter, to stay in the shadows. Her body, often draped in the symbols of nature, becomes an extension of the wildness inside her. Her long, flowing hair echoes the winds of rebellion, her eyes spark with a fierce intelligence, and her expression, always bold, defies the norms that seek to tame her. There's a darkness to her, yes, but it's the kind of darkness that comes with strength, with the refusal to be dimmed. Every brushstroke is a defiance against the world that would ever fade into the background, and every layer of paint tells a story of survival, of triumph, of a power that will never be erased. One of the most evocative images of Lilith in modern art captures her in a moment of escape. Her wings, vast and untamed, spread wide behind her as she turns away from the paradise that once tried to confine her. She is leaving, but not in shame, no, she is walking away on her own terms. The canvas pulses with energy, as if the very brushstrokes are alive with the power of her rebellion. There's no anger in her gaze, only a quiet satisfaction. She is free. The world might judge her, vilify her, but she is free to choose her own path, and the beauty of that freedom resonates with anyone who has ever yearned to break away from something or someone. But then there's the darkness. The seductive side of Lilith emerges in the art as well, as she is often depicted as a temptress, a figure of mystery and allure. In the hands of some artists, she becomes the embodiment of all that is forbidden, the woman who seduces with her power, her beauty, her very presence. In these depictions, Lilith seems to draw you in. Her gaze is knowing, almost hypnotic, as though she's calling you to join her in the rebellion, to accept that some rules are meant to be broken. She is not the evil that many have tried to paint her as, but a reminder that power comes in many forms, and sometimes it is the very things that others fear that hold the most allure. In modern media, Lilith continues to transform. She is reimagined, reshaped, and redefined in ways that speak to the ever-changing landscape of female empowerment. On the silver screen, in graphic novels, and even in video games, she has become a symbol not just of defiance, but of independence, strength, and resilience. She is both the demon and the goddess, the mother and the warrior. The artists who bring her to life in these mediums don't just depict her, they reimagine her, giving her new roles, new faces, and new narratives. Her story is no longer bound by ancient myths. It is alive, moving, ever-changing. Every frame, every scene, every image that captures Lilith speaks of her timelessness. She is a myth, yes, but she is also something more. She is a reflection of our deepest desires to be seen, to be heard, and to be free. And that freedom, whether painted, sculpted, or brought to life on screen, is the most haunting and beautiful part of her story. The moment you see her, truly see her, you realize that Lilith is not just a myth from a faraway past. She is here, now, in the world we live in, a part of every struggle, every fight for equality, every whisper of defiance. In some pieces, she's not alone. Surrounded by animals, nature, and the wild, she seems at one with the earth itself. Her body becomes a part of the landscape, her curves flowing like the waves of an ocean or the branches of a tree. In these pieces, Lilith represents not just rebellion against society, but a rebellion against the very idea of control. She is part of the earth, the sky, the moon. She is not an outsider, but a force of nature. And in that, she is both terrifying and beautiful. Every artist who has tried to capture Lilith in their work has understood that she cannot be contained. She is not a simple symbol, not a character that can be fully understood in one glance. She is everything, the angel, the demon, the mother, the rebel. Her presence, whether in a painting, sculpture, or modern piece of media, is a constant reminder that there is no one way to tell her story. Each depiction speaks to a different part of her, the strength, the mystery, the seduction, the pain. As you look at these images, whether through the delicate brushstrokes of an artist or the cold stone of a sculpture, you realize something profound. Lilith is not just a figure from the past. She is alive, breathing through every piece of art, every representation, every interpretation. She is not a character to be confined to the pages of ancient books. She is a force, a presence, a reminder that there is power in defiance, beauty in rebellion, and that the stories we tell about ourselves are never truly finished. In the flickering light of the screen, Lilith's eyes burn with an intensity that makes you question everything you know. She steps forward, no longer a mere myth from the pages of ancient texts, but a living, breathing force that commands your attention. In the world of movies, TV shows, and video games, she has evolved into something else entirely. No longer confined to the whispers of the past, Lilith has become a symbol of defiance, mystery, and raw, untamed power. On the screen, she doesn't just walk into the scene, she storms in. Whether it's a dark fantasy show or a horror thriller, Lilith's presence is one that shakes you to your core. In some depictions, she's a villain, a demoness so powerful, so alluring, that she draws you into her chaos. In others, she's a tragic figure, struggling against the forces that would destroy her. Her role might shift, but her essence remains the same, a woman who refuses to be bound by anyone's definition of what she should be. In one moment, you might see her seducing a powerful man, luring him into a twisted game of temptation. Her beauty is unmatched, but it's not just her appearance that captivates, it's her power, her ability to manipulate and control. In another, she's shown as the wronged woman, cast out of paradise, only to embrace her new role as a queen of the night. Her rage is palpable, her pain raw, and her need for vengeance intense. But there's a part of her that the world misses, the part that reminds you that she wasn't born evil. She was simply pushed too far, cast aside for refusing to conform, only to rise again stronger than ever before. Then there are the moments when she's not a villain at all. She becomes a hero in her own right, a force of nature that doesn't answer to anyone, not even the gods themselves. In this role, Lilith is a beacon for all who have ever felt oppressed or misunderstood. She's the woman who, despite every obstacle thrown her way, rises from the ashes of her torment to become something far greater than what the world intended. She is a warrior, a survivor, a symbol of rebellion that others can look to for strength. In video games, Lilith takes on even more forms, adapting herself to the ever-changing landscape of virtual worlds. Whether she's the final boss you must defeat or an ally who guides you on a treacherous journey, she commands respect. Players can't help but feel a shiver of excitement and fear when they see her name on the screen. Every decision she makes seems calculated, every word she speaks dripping with power and authority. Her abilities are unlike anything the other characters possess, dark, mysterious, and full of untapped potential. She's not just another character. She's the embodiment of the unknown, a challenge to everything the players think they know about the world. In these worlds, Lilith's backstory is often complicated. She's no longer just a rebellious first woman, cast out from paradise. She's the woman who has lived through centuries, seen civilizations rise and fall, and shaped the world with her presence. She's a survivor of unimaginable loss, a conqueror of demons, and a queen of realms unknown to mortals. Her motivations aren't always clear, but that's what makes her so captivating. You can't predict what she'll do next, and that unpredictability is what makes her such an exciting and terrifying force in these worlds. One moment, she's your enemy, an unstoppable force of destruction. The next, she's your ally, using her power to guide you through the darkness. Yet, there's something almost tragic about her. Beneath the layers of power, beneath the glamour and allure, there's a woman who has been cast aside. In these depictions, Lilith's power is a result of pain, of betrayal, of being misunderstood. She is not just a seductress or a villain, she is a woman who has been left to fend for herself, and in doing so, she has become something no one could have anticipated. Her journey is one of survival, but it's also one of loss. She's fought battles no one else could even imagine, and every scar on her body, every piece of her soul, tells the story of a woman who has been wronged and who will never let anyone forget it. It's not just her power that keeps you hooked. It's the humanity beneath that power. In her anger, in her seduction, in her rebellion, you can see parts of yourself. She is the woman who has been told to be less, to be quiet, to be small, and she has thrown all of that back in the face of the world. She is everything that society has tried to suppress, but in her defiance, she becomes more powerful than anyone could ever imagine. In some ways, Lilith's story in popular culture mirrors our own. She is the archetype of the woman who has been told she is too much, too loud, too bold, too fierce, and yet she refuses to be quieted. She is the woman who breaks free from the chains of the past and steps into her own power. Her journey speaks to the fight for equality, the struggle for freedom, and the need for every voice to be heard. In every role she plays, she is a reminder that power does not come from conforming, it comes from embracing your truth, no matter how uncomfortable that might be for others. The media have found endless ways to adapt and reimagine Lilith, and in each new interpretation, her essence shines through. She is still that same woman who refused to be silent, refused to be controlled. But now, she is not just a mythical figure, she is the face of rebellion, of power, and of the strength that comes with standing alone. She is every woman who has ever been told to step aside, to let others take the lead. She is every person who has fought against oppression, who has stood tall even when the world tried to knock them down. As the credits roll or the game comes to an end, there's a lingering sense that Lilith will never fade into the background. She is not a passing trend or a fleeting character. Her influence in popular culture is a testament to her power to inspire, to challenge, and to captivate. Whether she's a villain, a hero, or somewhere in between, one thing is certain: Lilith will continue to be a force that cannot be ignored. Lilith was cast into shadows long ago, her name whispered among those too afraid to speak her truth. But in the quiet corners of history, there was always a spark, a flicker of rebellion, a whisper of defiance. Over the years, that flicker grew into a flame. The woman who had once been condemned, exiled for her refusal to submit, was now being embraced, celebrated as a symbol of empowerment. In the streets where women marched, in the halls where activists raised their voices, the name of Lilith began to echo. She wasn't just a figure from ancient myths anymore, she was a symbol for the modern woman who dared to challenge the world's expectations, who refused to be bound by the rules written by others. She had been painted as a villain, a demoness, a threat. But now, she was being reimagined as something else entirely, the embodiment of strength, of resistance, of autonomy. The world had spent centuries labeling her as other, pushing her to the edges of stories and history. They told her to be silent, to submit, to accept her place in a world built by men. But Lilith had never accepted that. She had never bowed, never cowered. Instead, she had chosen to stand tall, to walk her own path, even if it meant standing alone. And in her defiance, in her rejection of a world that wanted to control her, she had become the beacon for women everywhere who fought for their voices to be heard. In the throes of feminist movements, Lilith's story was rewritten. She was no longer just the first woman who had been cast aside for daring to speak her mind. She was the woman who had claimed her freedom, who had chosen to take the power that was rightfully hers, even when the world tried to strip it away. She was the woman who had rebelled and in doing so had carved out a space where others could follow. She was the woman who had fought for equality, for the right to be heard, to be seen, to exist on her own terms. As her name began to resonate in the hearts of feminists, the significance of Lilith's story deepened. She wasn't just a symbol for women who fought for their rights, she was a reminder of the price of that fight. To stand tall and demand what was rightfully yours often meant facing rejection, facing isolation, even facing destruction. Lilith had paid that price. She had been cast out, shamed, misunderstood, and yet she had remained unbroken. And in that, feminists saw the courage to continue their fight, the strength to push forward even when the world seemed unwilling to give them the space they deserved. The icon of Lilith was no longer confined to dark corners of mythology or historical texts. She began to appear in feminist literature, art, and activism. Her image was painted on banners, her name shouted in rallies. She was the symbol of the woman who had been told she was too much, too loud, too powerful, and had chosen to embrace that power. She was the symbol of the woman who refused to be quieted, who refused to let others dictate her fate. As the feminist movements grew, Lilith's influence expanded. She was embraced not only by women but by anyone who had ever been told to shrink, to apologize for their existence, to accept a world that didn't want them to thrive. Her story wasn't just about gender, it was about power, about self-determination, about owning your truth. And in a world that had long attempted to silence women, Lilith became the voice that could no longer be ignored. She was the loud cry for equality, the relentless demand for respect, the unyielding force that refused to be silenced. But even more than that, Lilith's symbolism was about choice. She was the woman who had chosen her own path, no matter how difficult or isolating that path might be. She was the woman who, in her rebellion, had shown the world that there was power in making your own decisions and claiming your autonomy. In a time when so many women still struggled to have control over their own lives, Lilith became the symbol of that freedom. She wasn't a victim, she was a fighter, a survivor, a queen in her own right. In the quiet moments, when a woman stands alone against a world that tells her to be smaller, to be quieter, to be less, Lilith is there, standing beside her. When a woman refuses to stay in the background, refuses to accept the world as it is, Lilith is there, lighting the way. When a woman chooses to rise above the noise, to embrace her own power, Lilith is there, her presence felt like a quiet whisper of strength. Feminists, then, didn't just adopt Lilith as a symbol, they made her their own. She became a part of their story, a part of their fight, a part of the relentless pursuit of freedom. In her, they saw their own struggle reflected. In her defiance, they saw the courage to keep fighting. And in her strength, they found the power to rise up, to claim what was rightfully theirs. She was no longer just an ancient myth, she was the living, breathing embodiment of every woman who had ever fought for herself. Her transformation from a symbol of shame to a symbol of power wasn't just about reclaiming a story, it was about reclaiming a narrative. It was about rewriting history, about making space for the women who had been silenced, who had been told their stories didn't matter. Lilith's rise was the rise of every woman who had ever been told to sit down and be quiet, who had ever been told her voice didn't matter. Her name became a battle cry, a reminder that every woman has the right to stand tall, to speak her truth, and to take up space in a world that so often tried to push her aside. And so, Lilith lives on, not as a forgotten demoness, but as a symbol of power, of rebellion, and of the unyielding strength of women everywhere. Her story, once hidden in the shadows, now shines as a beacon for those who refuse to stay silent, for those who dare to rise above the world's expectations, for those who refuse to let anyone define their worth. She is the embodiment of the fight for freedom, for equality, for the right to exist without apology. There's a quiet, electric hum in the air as the moon rises high in the sky. Beneath its glowing light, an ancient ritual unfolds, whispers in the dark, incantations spoken with conviction, as flames flicker and shadows dance. Among those shadows, the figure of Lilith stands, not as a forgotten myth, but as a living, breathing force of power, an energy that has been reclaimed and is now revered. In the world of occultism, she is not feared. She is celebrated. Her presence is unmistakable. It lingers in the silence before a spell is cast, in the boldness of a witch who stands alone, unyielding and powerful. Lilith, the once misunderstood figure of myth, is now seen as a symbol of rebellion, of personal power, of defiance against the constraints of a world that tries to control, to silence, to diminish. In the realms of modern witchcraft and occult practices, she is a figure of transformation, a guide for those who seek to awaken their own latent strength. As candles flicker and the air becomes thick with intention, the practitioners call her name, invoking her energy. Not as a demon, but as a force of nature, a goddess of independence and autonomy. She is the embodiment of breaking free from the chains that bind us, those chains of tradition, of expectations, of roles we never asked to be cast into. In occultism, Lilith is not a symbol of sin, but of liberation. She is the one who says, "You are enough. You are powerful. You are deserving of freedom." It is in the quietest of moments when she speaks most profoundly. She is the stillness before a storm, the pause between breaths. The energy in the room shifts when she is called upon, a sharpness, a clarity that cuts through the noise of the world. Those who seek her power know that she does not come lightly. She does not offer easy answers. But she does offer the courage to confront, the strength to stand tall, and the wisdom to trust in one's own intuition. In the practice of modern witchcraft, Lilith has become a revered figure. She is invoked in spells of empowerment, of protection, of self-discovery. Her name is whispered in the dark, not to summon destruction, but to invite creation. She is the patron of those who dare to dream, who dare to question, who dare to walk a path uncharted by others. She is not a passive figure. She demands action. She demands that those who seek her guidance do so with the intent to change, to grow, to manifest their deepest desires. Her role in occultism is that of a guide, one who lights the way through the darkest of times, one who shows the power in embracing the unknown, and facing fears head-on, and in standing firm against forces that seek to control. She is not about submission. She is about sovereignty. She is about claiming your space in the world, unapologetically, without regret. For those who practice witchcraft, Lilith is not merely an icon, but a living, breathing force that influences their every spell, their every ritual, their every intention. She is the spark of creativity that ignites their work, the voice that urges them to take that step, to break free from old patterns, to break free from the limits that society has imposed upon them. She is not just a symbol of rebellion against patriarchy, she is a symbol of rebellion against anything that tries to stifle the human spirit. And yet, even with all her power, Lilith is not about dominance over others. She is not about control. Instead, she is about control over oneself. She teaches that true power comes not from imposing your will on others, but from mastering your own desires, your own emotions, your own destiny. To call upon Lilith is to take responsibility for your own life, to accept your own power, and to never again shrink in the face of obstacles. She is the reminder that we are all capable of shaping our own futures. The rituals that surround her are not just about casting spells. They are about tapping into something ancient, something primal that resides within every one of us. She is the call to reconnect with our own true nature, to shed the skin of who we've been told to be, and step into the truth of who we are. The witches who call upon her do not ask for power from an outside source, they ask for the strength to unlock the power that lies dormant within themselves. Lilith's role in occultism is that of the wise, the fearless, and the untamed. She is not just a goddess to be revered from afar, she is a guide who walks beside you, who challenges you, who pushes you to grow, to question, to evolve. In her presence, there is no room for self-doubt. She forces you to see your potential, to see your worth, to see that you are capable of anything you set your mind to. And that realization is terrifying. It is empowering. It is a realization that cannot be ignored. But with Lilith's power comes responsibility. She does not offer shortcuts. She does not give easy answers. To call upon her is to call upon change, deep, transformative change. It is to commit to breaking free from the past, to shedding the weight of old beliefs, to confronting the parts of yourself that are afraid to step into your full potential. Lilith challenges her followers to be unapologetically themselves, to live authentically and boldly, no matter the consequences. As the moon rises higher in the sky, casting its ethereal glow, those who seek Lilith's power feel the weight of her presence. The air thickens with her energy, her gaze seeming to pierce through the very fabric of the world. Her influence is undeniable. She is the shadow that lurks in the corners of the room, the silent force that drives those who seek her to embrace their fullest potential. And in that space, in that moment of silence, when the world feels suspended in time, Lilith's power is felt most strongly. It is not a power that comes with noise or force. It is a power that comes with stillness, with clarity, with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that you are enough. Lilith does not need to shout. She does not need to demand. She simply is, and in her being, she shows others that they too can simply be, and in doing so, they can transform the world around them. There's a quiet hum in the air, something almost imperceptible, like a whisper in your ear, a voice you can't quite place, but that feels hauntingly familiar. It's the sound of your own thoughts, your own fears, your own desires, gathering like storm clouds above you. And in the center of this whirlwind, there's a figure, a presence. Lilith. She is not just a myth or a demon. She is the embodiment of the parts of ourselves we cannot ignore, the parts that we bury deep, hoping they will remain silent. But they don't. She doesn't. In psychoanalysis, Lilith is more than just a symbol of rebellion or temptation. She is the manifestation of our unconscious mind, the shadow that we refuse to face. The parts of ourselves that we suppress out of fear, shame, or guilt. Lilith stands as a reminder that the darkness we run from isn't always evil. Sometimes, it's the truth we need to confront. The truth about our desires, our power, and our capacity to break free from the chains that hold us back. What if you allowed yourself to truly listen to those suppressed parts of your mind? What if you dared to confront the parts of yourself that society has deemed unacceptable? In psychoanalysis, Lilith is the figure who forces us to ask these questions. She is the archetype of the repressed woman, the one who refuses to stay silent, the one who rejects being controlled. She challenges us to face our fears, to explore the desires buried deep within our subconscious, and to confront the shadow of our own psyche. Her presence in the psychoanalytic world is like a mirror, reflecting back to us the parts we'd rather not see. She is the wild, untamed woman who refuses to fit into the neat little boxes we try to place her in. She refuses to be the obedient wife or the submissive lover. She is more than just a symbol of anger or defiance. She is the face of the parts of us that yearn to be seen and heard, but that have been denied a voice. In the quiet moments of introspection, you might feel the weight of Lilith's energy. It's heavy, almost suffocating. But it's also liberating. When you sit in silence and allow the thoughts you've repressed to surface, she is there, guiding you through the darkness. She is the key to unlocking the parts of yourself you've ignored for far too long. She asks you to question everything. Why have you been afraid? Why have you allowed yourself to remain small? Why have you chosen to deny the parts of yourself that could set you free? Psychoanalysis invites us to bring these questions into the light, and Lilith, in her silent, intense way, is the catalyst. She is the trigger that forces us to acknowledge the parts of our psyche that have been buried so deep we've almost forgotten they exist. Her power lies not in controlling us, but in showing us what happens when we stop hiding. When we stop pretending. When we stop living in the shadows of our own fears. There's an undeniable power in facing the darkness within. It's not the kind of power we've been taught to chase. It's not the power of domination or control. It's the power of understanding, of embracing all the parts of yourself, the beautiful, the ugly, the terrifying, and the tender. Lilith is the invitation to do just that. To stop running from your own reflection, to stop running from the parts of you that make you feel uncomfortable. But it's not easy. Facing your inner Lilith means facing the uncomfortable truths that lie within. It means confronting the shame, the guilt, the anger, and the longing that you've tucked away for so long. It means confronting the parts of yourself that society has told you to be ashamed of. The parts of you that long for freedom. The parts of you that hunger for expression. The parts of you that have been silenced for far too long. In psychoanalysis, these parts are known as the unconscious mind, the desires and fears that shape us, that govern our actions without us even realizing it. Lilith is the archetype that represents the repressed, the shadow that we deny and repress until it can no longer be ignored. She emerges when we push too hard against the boundaries of what is acceptable, when we suppress too much of ourselves. She is the voice in the back of your mind, the urge that you can't explain, the feeling that something is missing but you can't quite put your finger on it. She's the catalyst that forces you to listen to your own desires, your own needs, and your own inner wisdom. The path toward self-acceptance, toward healing, is not an easy one. It's filled with uncomfortable truths, with realizations that may shake you to your core. But it is in this discomfort that Lilith's power lies. She teaches us that it is not weakness to face our fears, to look at the parts of ourselves that we have been taught to despise. It is in these moments of confrontation that we grow, that we evolve, and that we begin to understand our true power. Lilith's role in psychoanalysis is not to fix us or make us perfect. She does not come with solutions or easy answers. Instead, she comes to show us the way, into the depths of our unconscious mind, into the places we've been avoiding. She is the guide who says, "Look here. Face this. It's time to stop running." In the work of psychoanalysis, confronting our shadows is often the most difficult but also the most transformative step. Lilith stands as the embodiment of that journey. She is the reminder that growth comes not from avoiding the darkness, but from walking straight into it. She asks us to sit with our fears, to sit with our desires, to sit with the parts of ourselves that we have denied for far too long. Only then can we truly understand our own power. As you sit with Lilith, there's a quiet stillness that falls over you. Her energy is not loud or brash, it is a soft, constant pressure, a pull toward the truth. And when you finally face it, when you allow yourself to feel the weight of all that you have ignored, you will understand the power she offers. It is the power of self-awareness. The power of being whole. The power of living unapologetically, without fear of what others may think. And in that moment, you will see Lilith not as a shadow, but as a beacon, showing you the way back to yourself. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting a soft glow over the landscape, illuminating the path ahead. It was the silence before the storm, a moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. In the quiet, you could hear the whisper of her name. Lilith. She wasn't a figure of evil or of shame, but rather a force of power and understanding, an embodiment of everything that had been pushed aside, misunderstood, and feared. In the darkest corners of the spiritual world, she stood tall, unbowed, reclaiming what was hers. For centuries, she had been cast out, labeled as a demon, a villain, a rebellious spirit. But what if Lilith was more than what history and religion had made her out to be? What if she was not the other, the outcast, but the divine feminine, rejected only because her power was too great to be contained in the boxes society had built? The story of Lilith is more than one of defiance. It is a story of strength, of reclamation, and of stepping into a role that had been denied for far too long. There was something ancient and untamed about her energy, like the wind that howls through the trees at night or the thunder that cracks the silence of a storm. She was more than a myth or a symbol. She was a reminder of the strength within every woman, every being that had been silenced or pushed into the shadows. And now, as the world began to shift, Lilith was starting to be seen in a new light. In spiritual practices, the divine feminine has always been a force of creation, intuition, and connection. But for far too long, it had been overshadowed by the patriarchal ideals that placed value on dominance and submission, control and subjugation. In the midst of this, Lilith emerged, a reminder that true power lies not in submission, but in independence. She was not just a figure of rebellion against Adam or a symbol of defiance against the divine. She was a beacon of what it means to stand in your own truth, to embrace your fullness without apology. Lilith's journey wasn't a story of hatred or bitterness, as many had been led to believe. It was a tale of reclaiming her own power, a power that came not from dominating others, but from owning her own voice and autonomy. In a world that told her to submit, to follow, she chose to stand alone. And in that act, she became a figure of empowerment for all who felt trapped by the confines of expectation. As spiritual practices began to evolve, Lilith found herself in a new light. She became an archetype, a symbol of the divine feminine in its truest form, untamed, unapologetic, and fiercely independent. Those who were drawn to her energy felt her strength, her presence, like a force of nature that could not be ignored. They began to see her not as a fallen figure, but as one who had risen, unbroken and whole. In the quiet moments of introspection, Lilith whispered to those who listened. She spoke of freedom, of liberation from the chains that held them back. She spoke of stepping into the fullness of their own being, without fear, without shame. For so long, women had been told to shrink, to conform, to fit into the molds others had created. But Lilith didn't fit into any mold. She broke the very notion that one had to conform in order to be worthy. Her energy was raw, untamed, and beautiful in its authenticity. And so, the divine feminine, through the lens of Lilith, began to be reevaluated. She became the symbol of a new kind of spirituality, one that rejected the limitations of the past and embraced the wild, untapped potential of the soul. Her energy was not something to be feared or avoided, but something to be honored. She was the flame that burned in the heart of every woman who had ever been told she was too much. She was the voice in the back of your mind, urging you to step into your power, to trust your instincts, and to let go of the fears that had held you captive for so long. As more people turned to spiritual practices that honored the divine feminine, Lilith's name was whispered with reverence, not with fear. She became a guide for those seeking to reconnect with their own power. She showed them that true spirituality didn't come from submission, but from embracing one's own truth, from standing firm in who you are and what you believe. Her teachings were not of quiet submission, but of loud, unapologetic truth. When you connected with Lilith, it was as if you were tapping into an ancient energy, a force that had been waiting for you to remember. It wasn't about worshiping her as an idol, but about recognizing the spark of divine power within yourself. Lilith's story was not about domination or destruction, it was about liberation. It was about breaking free from the chains of self-doubt and fear and stepping into a life of authentic expression. As spiritual communities began to embrace her as part of the divine feminine, Lilith's role shifted. She wasn't the fallen woman, the demon, the outcast anymore. She was the embodiment of the power that comes from claiming your own voice, your own sovereignty. In a world where so many were still fighting to be heard, Lilith stood as a reminder that true power doesn't come from being silent. It comes from being true to yourself, from embracing every part of who you are, even the parts that others have told you to hide. In this new era of spiritual awakening, Lilith was not just a figure to admire from afar. She was someone to learn from, to embody, to honor. She reminded everyone who walked the path of spiritual growth that they were not bound by the limitations of the past. They were not confined to the roles others had imposed upon them. They, like Lilith, had the power to break free and rise. Her presence in the divine feminine was not just symbolic, it was a call to action. It was a call to stand up, to speak out, to embrace every part of yourself, no matter how wild, no matter how untamed. It was a call to stop hiding, to stop conforming, and to start living unapologetically. Lilith was the embodiment of everything that had been silenced, suppressed, and denied, and in that silence, she found her voice. In that silence, she found her power. As the world continued to shift, so too did the understanding of the divine feminine. And in the midst of it all, Lilith remained a constant, a powerful force urging those who sought her wisdom to stand tall and embrace their truth. Her story wasn't just about rebellion, it was about reclaiming the divine power that had always been theirs to claim. Lilith stood at the edge of the world, a silhouette against the blood-red horizon. Her eyes, fierce and unyielding, gazed into the unknown, daring the universe to question her. She was not the meek woman history had been told to expect. She was the one who refused to fit in, to obey the rules, to follow the prescribed path. In that moment, she became something greater than a myth. She became a symbol. A symbol of defiance, of independence, of an identity that could not, and would not, be confined by the expectations placed upon her because of her gender. In a world that demanded silence, Lilith's voice rang out. In a society that imposed roles on her, she tore them apart. And in doing so, she sparked something that no one could have predicted, a challenge to the very foundations of gender itself. Her story was one of rebellion, but not the kind that sought to destroy for the sake of destruction. No, her rebellion was against the invisible chains that sought to bind her spirit, her essence, her being. She refused to be reduced to the roles that others had designed for her. She refused to be Adam's equal or lesser half. She refused to be his subordinate, his partner only when it suited him. Instead, she took her own place in the world, on her terms. In every legend, and every retelling of her story, the theme was clear: Lilith could not, would not, conform. She was not content to be the docile companion. She wanted more, and that hunger, her refusal to settle for what was expected of her, made her a threat. The men who told her story sought to erase her, to label her a demon, a fallen woman, a danger to society. But what if she was none of these things? What if she was simply a woman who dared to define herself outside of the limits imposed upon her? For centuries, Lilith's name was spoken in whispers, her story used to keep women in line, to remind them of what happened when they dared to step outside the narrow boundaries set for them. But as time went on, her story began to shift. No longer was she the villain, the outcast. Instead, she became the icon, the symbol of every woman who had ever felt shackled by the expectations of her gender. She was the woman who dared to choose herself, to refuse the roles others handed her. In a world where women were expected to be submissive, passive, and obedient, Lilith said no. She said, "I am not yours to tame. I will not be what you want me to be." And in doing so, she became a mirror for all those who had been told to stay quiet, to play their part, to fit into a mold that did not reflect their true selves. Lilith was the woman who stood up and said, "I am more than what you tell me to be." Her defiance, her rejection of the traditional roles given to women, stirred something deep inside the hearts of those who listened. She was not just a myth or a legend. She was a challenge to everything they had been told about gender. She was a beacon for all those who felt trapped in a system that demanded they shrink, that demanded they be small, that demanded they be docile. Her power didn't lie in her defiance alone, but in her unwavering refusal to be anything but her true self. In a world where women were told to be quiet, to be meek, to be pleasing, Lilith stood tall, unapologetic. She became the voice for all those who had been silenced, for all those who had been told to be less. She was the embodiment of freedom, the freedom to be herself, to define her own worth, to live on her own terms. In every corner of society, Lilith's story resonated. She became the face of rebellion, not just for women, but for anyone who had ever been told that they didn't belong, that they were too much, that they didn't fit. Her tale became one of empowerment, one that spoke to the heart of anyone who had ever been made to feel small because of who they were, because of how they identified. The more her story was told, the more it began to transcend its roots. It wasn't just about a woman defying the man in her life. It was about the collective defiance against the system, against the world that demanded conformity. It was about the refusal to accept the roles assigned to you simply because of your gender. It was about choosing to live authentically, to stand tall and unashamed, regardless of the labels placed upon you. Lilith's story shattered the walls that had been built around gender. She showed that a woman could be powerful, could be independent, could be wild, and that none of these things made her less of a woman. In fact, they made her more. The power of her voice, the strength of her autonomy, broke down the very notion that women had to conform to the roles that had been created for them. She was a woman who existed outside of those roles, who created her own, and in doing so, she left a legacy that would resonate for generations. And still, in the quiet of the night, her name is spoken. In the whisper of the wind, in the rustling of the trees, Lilith's spirit lingers, watching over those who still seek freedom, still seek the courage to live outside the confines of gender. She calls to those who dare to break the mold, to step away from the expectations that have been placed upon them, and to live fully as themselves. Her story is not just about one woman's rebellion. It is the story of every person who has ever been told that they are too much, too bold, too different. It is the story of those who refuse to shrink, who refuse to be less. In her defiance, Lilith offered something more than rebellion. She offered freedom. Freedom to be who you are without apology, without regret. And that freedom is a gift that resonates not just with women, but with all those who refuse to let gender define them. For Lilith, gender was not a limit. It was a starting point for something greater. She had no need to fit within the roles others had written for her. She wrote her own story. And in that story, there were no rules, no boundaries, no cages. There was only the pure, unyielding truth of who she was. And that truth was more than enough. She stood there in the soft glow of the moonlight, her silhouette a testament to something raw, powerful, and unbreakable. Lilith had always been a figure of defiance, but now, as the centuries passed, her message carried weight beyond rebellion. It spoke of something deeper, more profound, a vision of relationships where equality, independence, and respect weren't just ideals to be hoped for, but the very foundation upon which everything was built. Her story, often framed in the shadows of history, was now a torch for modern hearts searching for balance and authenticity in their connections with one another. What if relationships, at their core, were not meant to be power struggles or games of control, but partnerships of equals, each standing on their own yet united in their respect for one another? What if love didn't mean giving up your identity, but embracing it fully, with a partner who saw you as their equal, not their subordinate? Lilith's defiance wasn't about rejecting love, it was about claiming a love that respected the sovereignty of both individuals, a love where both could grow freely without fear of being stifled or diminished. Her story is a challenge to those who still cling to old narratives where one person must bend to the will of the other, where submission is expected, and where true equality feels like a dream too distant to reach. In the beginning, when Lilith walked away from Adam, it was a choice, a painful, heart-wrenching decision to leave behind the man who was supposed to be her partner. But that choice was not made in anger. It was made from a deep, abiding need for respect and equality. She didn't want to be second in someone else's life. She didn't want to live a life where her desires, her needs, and her voice were secondary. In that moment, Lilith became a symbol of what it means to demand respect in relationships, not in the form of power or dominance, but in the form of recognition. Recognition that both parties deserve to be seen, heard, and valued equally. What if we took a page from her book? In today's world, we are often told that relationships are about compromise. But what if, instead of compromising our very essence, we learned how to come together as equals, each standing firm in who we are, while also nurturing the bond that holds us together? What if we learned to listen to each other, truly hear one another, and not simply bend until we break in an attempt to please? Lilith's legacy is a reminder that true partnership isn't about sacrificing your identity. It's about honoring both your own and your partner's independence while weaving those individual threads into something stronger, something greater than either could create alone. As the world changes, so too does the way we approach relationships. The traditional roles that once defined partnerships, where one person had to dominate and the other submit, are no longer as relevant as they once were. Instead, we are starting to understand that love isn't about power, but about partnership. The dance between two individuals should not be one of dominance and submission, but one of mutual respect, of walking alongside one another. Lilith, in her boldness and strength, rejected the idea of a one-sided relationship. And in doing so, she gave us a new vision, one where both people are free to be themselves, to express themselves fully, and to grow together. It is said that love requires sacrifice, but what if it doesn't have to come at the cost of who you are? What if love could be the very thing that encourages you to thrive, to be the fullest version of yourself, without fear of losing the other person in the process? Lilith's story teaches us that the healthiest relationships are those in which both individuals are free to be who they are, free to pursue their passions, free to dream without limitation. The moment we stop seeing our partners as possessions or roles to be played, and instead as full, whole beings, the stronger the relationship becomes. In the silence of the night, Lilith's spirit calls out to those in love, those who are navigating the complexities of their own relationships. She asks, are you truly free? Are you both truly equal? Or have you allowed old patterns to creep in, diminishing your voice, your worth, and your power? Her message is not one of judgment but of liberation, a liberation that comes when both partners stand side by side, supporting one another, but also allowing room for each person to stand alone when needed. It's the liberation that comes when love doesn't feel like a cage, but like a safe space for each person to grow, explore, and be free. We are taught in many stories that love means sacrifice, but Lilith reminds us that real love is not about sacrifice, it's about freedom. The kind of freedom that lets both people walk their own paths, even while they walk together. The kind of freedom that allows each individual to flourish without fear of being consumed by the other. This is the love she was searching for, the love that doesn't demand submission but encourages growth. It's a love where equality and respect are not negotiable, but essential. And it's a love where both people can look into each other's eyes and say, I see you. I see all of you. And I will honor you for exactly who you are. Her story, her rebellion, has become something more than just the tale of a woman who walked away from a man. It has become a beacon for all of us to look at our own relationships and ask, are we really seeing each other? Are we really respecting each other? Are we really partners, or are we playing roles, trapped in expectations that suffocate us? In her quiet defiance, Lilith teaches us that love is not about who wins and who loses. It's not about one person bending to the will of another. It's about standing tall, side by side, each person sovereign in their own right, yet bound together by a mutual respect that keeps the relationship alive. A relationship, after all, isn't about control. It's about freedom. And Lilith, in her wild, untamed spirit, is a reminder that we deserve nothing less. The moon hung heavy in the sky, its pale light spilling across the earth like a whispered secret. Beneath its glow, shadows stretched long and deep, reaching into places we often avoid, the hidden corners of our souls, where fears, desires, and forgotten truths lie in restless silence. It is in these shadows that Lilith's presence is felt most vividly, not as a villain or a monster, but as a mirror to everything we refuse to see in ourselves. She stands, unwavering, in the darkness we fear to face, her gaze piercing yet compassionate. Lilith is not the enemy of light, she is its balance, the keeper of the truths we bury. Her story is not just one of rebellion but of reckoning, a call to embrace the parts of ourselves we've been taught to hide, the anger we suppress, the pain we deny, the passions we silence for fear of judgment. She whispers not to taunt but to guide, urging us to look within, to confront what we've long avoided, and to see the beauty in the brokenness. Shadow work is not an easy path. It is messy, painful, and sometimes terrifying. It demands that we sit with our shame, our guilt, and our darkest memories. And yet, Lilith's story tells us that there is power in facing these parts of ourselves. There is healing in acknowledging the wounds we carry, even if it means bleeding a little more before we can truly begin to mend. The shadow self is not the enemy, it is a part of us, waiting to be understood and integrated so we can step into the wholeness of who we truly are. Her tale is one of refusal, not to face others, but to abandon herself. When she walked away from Eden, she didn't just leave Adam behind, she left the expectations that sought to chain her. She chose exile over erasure, darkness over dishonesty. She chose to be true to herself, even if it meant being cast as a demon. And isn't that the essence of shadow work? To face the discomfort of truth, even if it means shedding the masks we've worn for so long? The shadows are where we store our unspoken desires and the anger we've swallowed for years. They hold the tears we cried in silence and the parts of ourselves we were told were unworthy. Lilith beckons us to sit in that space, to hold those emotions in our hands and ask, "Why are you here? What do you need me to learn?" She doesn't offer comfort in the traditional sense. Her comfort lies in the strength she imparts and the courage she inspires to keep looking even when the darkness feels unbearable. There is no shame in the shadow. There is no shame in feeling anger, in admitting fear, in wanting more than you were taught to accept. Lilith's story teaches us that these feelings, though often buried, are valid. They are signs of life, of humanity, of a spirit that refuses to be confined. To embrace the shadow self is not to surrender to it, but to understand it, to learn from it, and to transform it into something powerful and purposeful. The process is not linear. Some nights, the shadows will feel too heavy, too suffocating. But then there are moments of clarity, fleeting, like moonlight breaking through clouds, where you'll see the pieces start to fit together. You'll see how the pain shaped your resilience, how the anger fueled your boundaries, how the parts of yourself you once despised were the very things that kept you alive. Lilith stands in those moments, not as a savior but as a reminder that you always had the strength within you. And facing the shadow, you reclaim the parts of yourself you thought you had lost. You begin to understand that the shadow is not separate from you, it is a part of your story, as integral as the light. And with that understanding comes a sense of freedom, a freedom that Lilith has embodied since the moment she chose herself over conformity. She doesn't promise an easy path, but she promises one that is honest, raw, and ultimately liberating. And as you sit with the shadow, as you confront the truths you've hidden, you may find yourself thinking of Lilith not as a figure of fear, but as a guide. A reminder that it's okay to be messy, to be imperfect, to be human. She shows us that there is no shame in the shadow, only lessons waiting to be learned. And with each lesson, you move closer to the wholeness that she represents, a wholeness that doesn't shy away from darkness but embraces it as part of the light. The room is quiet, save for the ticking of a clock, a sound that feels louder than it should. A woman sits at her desk, pen in hand, her face set in determination. She has just read the story of Lilith, not the version passed down in hushed warnings, but the raw, unapologetic account. The Lilith who walked away. The Lilith who chose freedom over subjugation. The Lilith who was vilified for daring to demand equality. A shiver runs through her, not of fear but of recognition. She has seen this story before. She has lived it. Lilith's resonance with today's feminist ideals is not just about rebellion, it's about survival. It's about carving space in a world that seems intent on shrinking you. Her story is a mirror for every woman who has been told to stay silent, to settle, to smile when she doesn't want to. She stands for the right to say no, to demand respect, to take up space unapologetically. She is not just a symbol, she is a rallying cry. In the flickering light of history, her name was often whispered with disdain. But those whispers carried truths too powerful to be erased. They said she refused to lie beneath Adam, that she refused to be less than his equal. In that single act of defiance, she became a force larger than herself, a voice for all who have ever been told to know their place. And though she was cast out, she carried her dignity with her. Her exile was not a defeat, it was an act of reclamation. For modern feminists, Lilith is not just a figure of the past. She is a reminder of what it means to stand firm, even when the world tries to knock you down. She embodies the anger that bubbles beneath the surface, the anger that comes from centuries of being dismissed and underestimated. But she also carries the hope, the strength, and the unwavering belief that things can change. Her story pulses with the energy of women who marched for the right to vote, who demanded equal pay, who shattered glass ceilings. It echoes in the voices of those who speak out against injustice, who refuse to be silenced, who fight for a world where equality isn't just an ideal but a reality. Lilith's spirit is woven into the fabric of every protest sign, every rallying cry, every moment of resistance. And yet, her resonance isn't just about the grand gestures. It's in the quiet moments, too. In the woman who walks away from a toxic relationship because she knows her worth. In the mother who teaches her daughter that her voice matters. In the teenager who refuses to conform to expectations that don't align with who she is. Lilith lives in those choices, in the bravery to choose oneself, even when it's the harder path. Her power lies in her refusal to be defined by others. She wasn't just Adam's counterpart, she was her own person. She wasn't content to play a role that didn't fit. And isn't that what feminism strives for? The freedom to define oneself, to break free from labels and limitations? Lilith's legacy is not about perfection, it's about authenticity. It's about embracing every part of who you are, even the parts that others may find uncomfortable. But her story also serves as a reminder of the cost of defiance. The world doesn't always welcome strong women. It often tries to demonize them, to paint them as unworthy or dangerous. Lilith's exile is proof of that. But her story doesn't end there. She thrived in the wilderness, creating a life on her own terms. And that's what makes her story so powerful, not that she faced adversity, but that she refused to let it break her. In today's world, her story feels more relevant than ever. The fight for equality continues, with new challenges and old prejudices rearing their heads. But Lilith's legacy is a beacon, a reminder that progress is possible, even when it feels out of reach. She teaches us that it's okay to be angry, to demand more, to fight for what you deserve. She teaches us that it's okay to be human, with all the complexities and contradictions that come with it. And as her story unfolds in the minds and hearts of those who hear it, it connects to something larger, something that transcends time and place. It becomes a thread in the ongoing tapestry of feminism, a story that inspires and challenges and moves us forward. The candle flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls, shapes shifting as though alive. In the center of the room, a woman sat cross-legged, her eyes closed, her breath steady. Her hands hovered above an ancient symbol drawn in salt, a serpent intertwined with a crescent moon. She whispered a name, soft yet powerful, Lilith. A chill moved through the air, not of fear, but recognition. It was as though the very essence of the name reached out and wrapped itself around her spirit, reminding her of something she had always known but forgotten, a power buried deep within. In the quiet revival of New Age spirituality, Lilith has returned, not as a villain, but as a guide. She is no longer bound by the constraints of her mythic exile. Instead, she emerges as a symbol of unapologetic authenticity, a beacon for those seeking to reclaim the parts of themselves they were taught to fear or reject. For the modern seeker, Lilith represents liberation, the raw and unfiltered truth of what it means to be fully alive. The image of Lilith that now calls out to spiritual practitioners is one of empowerment. She is the energy that urges you to step into your own skin without shame. She whispers that it's okay to defy expectations, to shed the roles that no longer serve you. Her resurgence feels less like a resurgence and more like a homecoming, a truth that was always there, waiting to be remembered. In circles of New Age spirituality, Lilith is often invoked as a goddess of the wild feminine, a force that cannot be tamed. Her presence is felt in the roar of the ocean, the howl of the wind, and the fire that burns without being extinguished. She is the primal, untamed energy that pulses through the earth and the human soul alike. For those seeking empowerment, she offers not just inspiration but transformation. To call upon Lilith is to call upon your own strength, to face the shadows and emerge stronger on the other side. For many, Lilith is more than a symbol, she is a companion on the spiritual path. In rituals of healing and empowerment, her energy is called upon to break chains and dissolve the walls of self-doubt. She becomes the voice that tells you to stand taller, to speak louder, to trust yourself more deeply. Her story, no longer a cautionary tale, becomes a rallying cry for self-worth and resilience. Her connection to the moon resonates deeply with those attuned to the cycles of nature. The moon, like Lilith, is both light and shadow, a constant reminder of duality and balance. To honor Lilith is to honor the cycles of life, to accept the waxing and waning, the growth and release. Under the light of the moon, seekers often feel her presence most strongly, as though she walks beside them in the stillness of the night, urging them to embrace their truth. But Lilith's energy is not gentle or soft, it is fierce and unyielding. She does not offer comfort in the traditional sense, instead, she offers clarity. She holds up a mirror and asks you to see yourself fully, to confront the parts you'd rather ignore. For some, this is a terrifying prospect. For others, it is the very thing they've been searching for, a chance to shed the masks and stand in their full power. Her resurgence in New Age spirituality speaks to a hunger for something real, something that goes beyond the surface. In a world that often demands conformity, Lilith offers a radical alternative, to be wholly, unapologetically yourself. She reminds us that there is strength in vulnerability, that the act of owning your story, your whole story, is a revolutionary act. And as her name is spoken in sacred spaces, her influence ripples outward. She becomes a part of the collective consciousness, a reminder that the path to empowerment is not linear or easy, but it is worth it. Her presence is felt not only in spiritual practices, but in the way people live their lives, boldly, authentically, without apology. Lilith does not promise answers. She does not offer easy solutions. What she offers is a challenge, to step into the wilderness of your own soul and find what lies within. To embrace both the light and the shadow, the beauty and the rawness of being human. To become, in every sense of the word, whole. A child sat beneath the spreading branches of an ancient tree, her small hands tracing patterns in the dirt. She listened as her grandmother's voice rose and fell like a soft song, recounting a tale from a time long before the world she knew. It wasn't a story of princes or queens, nor one of victory and conquest. This was a story of a woman, fearless, defiant, untamed. Her name was Lilith. The girl's eyes widened, not with fear but with wonder, as her grandmother's words painted an image of strength, of fire that refused to be extinguished. In that moment, Lilith was no longer a figure of the past, she was alive in the present, reaching through time to whisper a promise to the future. The story of Lilith is not bound by centuries or cultures. It lives in the cracks of society's rules, in the spaces where people yearn for something more, a world where individuality is celebrated, and every voice matters. As the world changes, her myth transforms, shedding its skin and adapting to new generations. She becomes a reminder that the fight for equality, freedom, and respect is never over, that it's etched into the fabric of humanity's evolution. For the dreamers, Lilith offers the courage to imagine a world that hasn't yet been built. She is the spark that ignites movements, the echo in the chants of those who march for justice. To future generations, she is not just a legend, she is a call to action, a challenge to rewrite the rules, to question everything that has been taken for granted. Her refusal to submit becomes a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance against anything that seeks to stifle the human spirit. Lilith's story is powerful because it speaks to what lies dormant in so many, the need to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. For the artists, her story inspires visions that break barriers, colors that bleed outside the lines, words that demand to be read. For the leaders of tomorrow, she offers the strength to stand firm, even when the world insists on bending them into shapes that fit its mold. But her influence doesn't stop at movements or policies, it extends into the quiet spaces, the intimate moments where real change begins. A young girl looks into the mirror and no longer sees imperfections, she sees possibilities. A boy learns that strength doesn't mean dominance and that vulnerability is not weakness. A parent teaches their child that love is not about control, but about mutual respect. These are the seeds of change, planted quietly but growing with unstoppable force. Lilith's tale is woven with themes that challenge and inspire. To future generations, she offers the wisdom to balance independence with connection, strength with empathy. Her defiance against conformity teaches that the path forward is rarely straight or simple. It is carved by those brave enough to forge their own way. She is a reminder that even in exile, there is power, even in rejection, there is growth. Her myth doesn't end in tragedy or triumph. It continues to evolve, taking on the struggles and hopes of each new age. It's in the voices of those who refuse to be silenced, and the art that pushes boundaries, and the innovations that dare to imagine a fairer, freer world. Lilith's story is not static, it's alive, breathing with the energy of every person who has ever yearned for more. And as the world moves forward, as society reshapes itself again and again, Lilith's legacy will not fade. It will grow stronger, whispered from one generation to the next. Her myth will be a light for those navigating the darkness, a reminder that there is beauty in resistance, power in being unapologetically yourself. Through her story, the world will continue to learn that to challenge the old is to create the new. In the distance, a storm brews, not one of destruction, but of renewal, of transformation. The future holds its breath, waiting to see how Lilith's fire will shape what comes next. Her name echoes like a heartbeat, steady, relentless, alive. The firelight flickered across her face, casting shadows that danced like whispers on the cave walls. A group sat huddled, their breath misting in the cool air, as the elder began her tale. Her voice carried the weight of ages, the sound both soft and sharp, like the blade of truth cutting through silence. She was called a demon, yet she fought for freedom. She was named a monster, yet she offered courage to the forgotten. Who was Lilith? The question lingered, heavy and electric, pulling each listener into the heart of her paradox. Lilith's name stirs something primal, an unease that blends with fascination. To some, she is the embodiment of terror, a dark, winged creature stalking the night, her laughter cold, her vengeance fierce. But to others, she is freedom incarnate, a figure who broke chains rather than wear them, who chose solitude over submission. The lines between demoness and liberator blur, leaving her image suspended between fear and admiration. And perhaps that's the very essence of her power. Her story refuses simplicity. In one telling, she is the first to defy authority, the first to utter the word no with unflinching resolve. This act of defiance marked her, twisted her into the other, someone who must be feared, controlled, or eradicated. She became a scapegoat for chaos, for all that could not be tamed. Yet, her resistance also illuminated truths that many dared not face. It questioned why submission was demanded and why independence was punished. To label her as a demon was to silence her rebellion. To see her as a liberator was to embrace the uncomfortable truths she revealed. In the dead of night, as myths warn of her approach, one wonders, was Lilith's darkness born of malice, or was it the shadow cast by those who sought to control her light? She becomes a reflection of the fears society carries, the fear of voices that challenge, of forces that cannot be contained. To call her a demon was easier than to confront the possibility that she was right. But the same voice that terrified also inspired. To those who felt caged by tradition, Lilith offered an image of freedom, wild and unrelenting. Her refusal to bend became a source of strength, her exile a path to finding one's own place. For every whisper of her as a destroyer, there was an echo of her as a creator, someone who shaped her destiny with unyielding hands. This duality isn't just her story, it's humanity's. Every person carries light and shadow, the potential to build or break. Lilith doesn't force a choice between the two. She reminds us that both can exist together, that the fire of rebellion can warm even as it burns. Her existence challenges the idea of perfection, of neat categories where one is either good or evil, hero or villain. She lives in the space between, raw and real. In the quiet moments, when doubt creeps in and the weight of expectation feels unbearable, Lilith's defiance whispers through the cracks. She stands as a reminder that the cost of freedom is often misunderstanding, that to stand apart is to risk being seen as the enemy. But through that risk lies the chance to be true to oneself, to live authentically, unbound by fear. Her legacy isn't just a question of whether she was demoness or liberator. It's the understanding that she can be both. That her rage can be justified, her independence inspiring, her darkness a mirror. It's the knowledge that every scream, every act of rebellion, holds the potential to reshape the world. And as the elder's story ended, the firelight dimming to embers, the group sat in silence, each grappling with what they had heard. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the echoes of a name both feared and revered. The elder leaned closer, her voice a soft whisper, "What will you make of her? What will she make of you?" A single flame danced on the wick of a candle, its fragile light casting long shadows against the walls of the room. The air felt thick, heavy with a kind of expectancy, as if the space itself was holding its breath. In that trembling glow, one could feel her presence, not as a phantom or an ancient warning, but as something far more profound. She was there in the flicker of the fire, in the silence that begged to be broken, in the questions that whispered louder than answers. Lilith. Her name hangs in the air like a challenge, a promise, a defiance that refuses to fade. Thousands of years have passed, yet her voice still echoes, louder now than ever before. Why? Because she is not just a figure of the past. She is a force, alive and unrelenting, stirring something deep within those who dare to confront her story. She speaks to anyone who has felt chained by expectations, anyone who has stared into the abyss of rejection and dared to claim it as their own. Her legacy isn't confined to ancient texts or whispered myths. It lives in every act of rebellion, every moment someone chooses their truth over silence. She reminds us that there is power in standing alone, even when the world turns its back. Especially then. Through the ages, they tried to silence her. They painted her in dark hues, made her a warning instead of a wonder. Yet, every time her name was spoken in fear, it sparked curiosity in another. Who was this woman, this figure who refused to bow? Her resilience was a quiet flame, passed from hand to hand, growing brighter as it illuminated the spaces no one dared to look. The corners where shame festered, where doubt grew, where the forgotten hid.